Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 34th and final meeting of the Justice Committee for 2020. We have no apologies this morning. Our first agenda item is to continue consideration of the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill, and I refer members to the relevant papers in our pack. This morning, we're going to take evidence from three panels, and I welcome our first panel of witnesses this morning, who are all attending remotely, as indeed are all members. We have with us this morning Tam Bailey, Vice Chair of CPC Scotland, Dr. Marcia Scott, Chief Executive Officer of Scottish Women's Aid, and Lindsay Monaghan, who is a solicitor with the Scottish Women's Rights Centre. Welcome to all of you. I'm afraid because we are, as usual in this committee, very tight for time, we're not going to have time for opening statements this morning from any of the witnesses. But we've received your written submissions, for which many thanks, and your written submissions are, of course, as always, published on the committee's web pages. Members have been asked to direct their questions to particular witnesses. Please don't feel that you have to add that you agree with what you've already heard if you do indeed agree with it. But of course, if you disagree and if you have something in addition that you'd like to add to what's being asked of another witness, then please indicate using the chat box on Blue Jeans, and we'll come to you. But we've got a lot of questions and a short period of time. So with this too lengthy introduction, I'll invite Rona Mackay to open the questions, short questions and short answers, and we'll get through. Thank you very much. Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to start by asking about the existing powers available to the police and criminal courts. You know, that there are powers that can restrict movements of a suspected perpetrator, such as a release of an undertaking, bail conditions, under investigative liberation. Can you maybe explain what gap there is in the existing powers that the DAPN would address? And that the Law Society view is that the proposed link between a DAPN and investigative liberation isn't clearly articulated, and there could be some sort of duplication of powers. Can I maybe ask your views on that, starting with Marcia, Tom, and then Lindsay, please?
Good morning. I'm happy to answer that. I would say that it's very evident to us that there is a gap in the law for two reasons. One is you look at the gap between what criminal justice surveys tell us is the prevalence of domestic abuse in Scotland and what the reporting rate to Police Scotland is. It's really quite clear to us, and certainly from what we have been hearing for decades from women on the ground, that they do not feel sufficiently protected under the existing scheme to actually call the police. And the second thing, I suppose, is that these kinds of orders exist in a huge number of countries, have been in place for decades in many of the countries as part of a scheme of protection for women and children, and in fact are required under the Istanbul Convention. So, you know, there's a massive opinion that says without emergency barring orders of this ilk, then the ability of police to actually protect children and women is hampered. And so that's why we would support this bill.
Thank you. Tam, could I have your views, please?
Yeah, thank you. Welcome. Apologies for the interference machine. It's my reserve machine. Firstly, I think there are insufficient measures right now. For instance, there may be not enough evidence in terms of put conditions on bail, and the facility of using inclusion orders, which came in the 95 Act, which was very well intentioned, but it's hardly used, and it's actually quite difficult for women and children to actually exercise that. And if the intention of the bill really is to keep the family stable whilst to look at other options, then it fulfills that, for me, it fulfills that function.
Thank you. Lindsay.
Good morning, thanks for having me on today. So on behalf of the Scottish Women's Rights Centre, we would welcome the bill and its intentions, despite some comments that we've made in terms of some of the aspects which we think would strengthen the bill. But in terms of the current existing measures, we see through our outreach to look at helplines and surgeries, we see from women that there's often a gap where women have reported domestic abuse but there's perhaps insufficient evidence for bail conditions to be put in place or for any further criminal process to be engaged with. So where there's that gap, women are quite often informed by the police or referred by the police to civil solicitors to go and try and get protective orders. But we'll see there'll be a gap in protection between the reporting of the abuse or the ending of the relationship and then trying to get these civil protective measures in place, which could be a non-harassment order or interim interdicts or exclusion orders, as Tam was discussing. And we know that notoriously it's difficult to get these kind of orders in place depending on the circumstances of the case. So certainly we hear and see real gaps in protection, which I believe this bill is looking to address and could certainly address. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. Just a very brief follow-up, please. Pretty much along the same lines, I mean, some witnesses have said that, there's a view that, there could be over legislation here, that it's a very complex system already. I think obviously it's important there's a clear pathway for victims for protection. So, I mean, is there a danger that these orders could, make the system even more complicated, and it might actually kind of hamper? The government is looking to sort of have a wider review of civil protection orders generally. Would this confuse matters, do you think, or are you quite clear that there's a definite need for these orders? If I could go to Marcia first, please.
I don't think there's any question that there is a need for these orders. I sympathize with the complexity question, but really I think if you weigh in the balance complexity versus safety, we know what has to win. I think this is about putting in place, plugging the gap, and then seeing how the law works and how the courts respond. And then if we need further amendments, then that's where we go.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Tam.
Thanks. Of course, we live in enormously complex systems. So I understand the arguments about bringing in new orders and how that would make it more complex. And I think that might come to bear when we talk about the length of the order. For me, it's a very short-term measure, whereas what we're aiming for is for longer-term stability for the women and children. And coming at it from a children's point of view, the last thing we want is for children to be moving around, losing friends, family, contact with their schools. So anything that can stabilise that situation, and I would say for the longer term. So yeah, I accept that there's an added complexity there, but maybe we can take some of the sting out of that when we come to discuss the length of the orders and how they're actually impact on the family. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Lindsay?
I would just echo what my fellow speakers have said. I would only add that the intention, obviously, of the bill is that these orders and notices complement the current civil protective orders that are in place, and so there is a need. There's a great need for this interim protection, between a period of getting further protection in place, and it is really just a question, I think, now of the length of the order and how those complement the other systems that are in place. But like Tam said, perhaps that's a discussion for later.
Sure. Thank you, convener. That's me.
Thank you very much, Rona. Yeah, I think we will come to that question of duration later on in the questions this morning. But Rhoda Grant is going to pick up the questioning from here, please, and then after Rhoda, it'll be John Finney. Rhoda.
Thank you, convener. The government have made it clear that the notices and orders will take priority over other legal measures relating to children, like those under the child protection system, court orders, custody and the like. This isn't on the face of the bill. This is what the government have stated. One, do you think that that's the right approach policy-wise? And secondly, would it be better that this were in the face of the bill rather than in guidance? maybe go to Tam first and then Marcia.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'm pleased that the bill actually says that they should take the views of children into consideration, and there's both at the notice stage and at the order stage, there's a requirement to consider the welfare of children. I would suggest actually it would be better worded if it was best interest, given that we're about to introduce legislation on the UNCRC. So those requirements for me do have to take account of whatever else is happening in the child's life. The one thing I would say that's not there, which is any contact arrangements that the children may wish to be in place if they're asked their views. So I don't think it's just straightforward as overriding, because the sheriff already has to take account of currently welfare. I would suggest it's best interest, and secondly the views of the child. And I can imagine that there'll be very many complex situations which might not lend themselves to the one bit of the legislation trumping another bit of legislation. The fact that we've got the conditions in there for the sheriff to consider, I think, is a safeguard. But like I said, it's not perfectly worded just now from my point of view. Thank you.
Marcia?
I share your concerns, I think, Rhoda, which is I would the bill a clear indication about whether existing or contact orders are whether the domestic abuse protection notice and order supersedes those contact arrangements. We know that one of the most significant sites of danger at the ending of a relationship where domestic abuse is present is child contact, and this can happen certainly after the parties are no longer living together. And I think it's really important that it be laid out really clearly for the court and for the police that child contact arrangements are superseded by these orders. There's short orders. There's absolutely plenty of time for those contact arrangements to be put back in place if that seems appropriate to the court. But this is really a dangerous time for families, and it's absolutely critical that children and their mothers are not forced into dangerous situations by unintended consequences around enforcement of contact. I just want to add to what Tam was saying and point out that we're a bit concerned actually about the wording around seeking the views of children. Certainly in terms of the notices, we understand that might not be possible, but I think that what we would like to see, certainly under the orders, but across the whole bill, is a bit stronger language about requiring them to seek the views. Now, that doesn't mean that you can always get those views, but I think the existing language about being, if they're aware of the views is not strong enough.
Okay, and Lindsay, do you have anything to add, especially around whether it should be guidance or whether it should be on the face of the bill?
I don't have much to add to what my fellow speakers have said. I do agree that it needs to be clearer, and that is certainly the Scottish Women's Rights Centre's position, that it isn't as clear in the bill just now as it could be. The main concern that we would have is the impact that would have on women if, for example, an order is put in place and it stops any contact. The main concern would be that it was clear enough that guidance either through the bill or to women provided by the police or whoever's putting in place the court at whatever stage we're at is what is expected of them and whether or not they require to facilitate contact and what that should look like. Because quite often what we find is that when new legislation is put in place, if it's not clear enough, then we have women contacting our service asking, what should I do here? Can I allow it? Should I allow it? Am I breaching anything? And if there's no contact arrangements in place, contact order in place, am I able to still facilitate this? So there's a requirement for it to be clear, both I think through the bill and also through hopefully guidance.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I'll come back to seeking the opinions of children later on, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Tam has indicated that he wanted to come back in on the basis of what I think we just heard from Martha Scott. So can we just invite Tam back in before I move to John Finney, please?
Yeah, it's on this business of the interaction of child protection processes and the order itself. It will be important when we talk about the length of the order, to actually consider that what children some children will want ongoing contact, and contact arrangements are really difficult at the best of times. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't attend to them as we try and build in extra stability and protections for the family. Contact, we will have to deal with how we arrange contact, and I know that it's one of the most difficult decisions for sheriffs to take, often because of the quality of the information that is before them. So it's a really critical part, and we shouldn't just say one bit of legislation overrides the other just because it's a really problematic area, and it has been for many years.
Thank you, Tam. Thank you, Tam. With that, I'm going to pass the questioning over now, if I may, to John Finney, please. Morning, John.
Good morning, Convener. Thank you very much, and good morning, panel. I would like to ask about the question of proportionality on the issue of the notices, if I may, please. Now, the good news is no organisation offering views to the committee has disputed the need for effective legal response to the issue of domestic abuse. However, members of the Justiciary and the Law Society have expressed concerns about the test set out in Section 4 of the bill. In particular, they're worried about the evidential threshold which must be met before a notice can be imposed. How would you respond to the Law Society and the Sheriffs Associations who, as a result of the wording in Section 4, are questioning whether a DAPN is a proportionate measure in relation to the relevant convention rights? Maybe Dr. Scott first, please.
I think I sort of default to the same answer on this in some ways, which is really evident to us that the existing regime of protection is not working. And I'm slightly unsurprised by the objections of the Law Society and the Sheriff's Association, because we heard these kind of discussing the Domestic Abuse Scotland bill. I think that the reality here is that we have to weigh the consequences of not acting, and this is a civil order. Obviously, the requirements are less stringent under a civil order, and I think that gives us the flexibility here. And obviously, we have to invest in the resources and training for police, because they're going to be at the sharp end of this. But that the reality is that the evidence requirements don't seem draconian to us, and they do seem to offer some protection to reassure the rest of the legal system.
Thank you. Ms. Monaghan, and then Mr. Bailey, please.
Hi, sorry. So I would just comment that in terms of the definition of the bill, we are happy that it reflects the current Domestic Abuse Act 2018, and that's an appropriate definition, which then would lead me to say that in terms of if a person was reporting domestic abuse to the police, they're reporting it, and hopefully under the domestic abuse legislation, it would be considered a crime, and then protective measures would be put in place. But quite often what we find is there's insufficient evidence, and therefore they just don't meet that high threshold of the criminal element. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that the behaviour doesn't fall into that category, and therefore that person requires protection, and there's a need for that. In terms of proportionality, that's not really something that I would be able to comment on today. However, I do believe that there's a requirement for the protection. We see in England and Wales that they are undergoing a review of very similar legislation that they have, and that it was agreed that the threshold that they had down in England, which was threat of violence or physical violence, was just too high, and it isn't reflective of it isn't reflective of coercive control and psychological abuse. And real lived experiences of women experiencing domestic abuse, and so I'm content with the bill and how and the protection it would provide to women in those circumstances.
Mr. Bailey.
Yeah, thank you. The issue of proportionality it's actually not really my area of expertise, but if I was to choose between the proportionate response versus the increased safety of women, and in particular children, then I think I would fall on the side of the increased safety. And the other aspect of it is that the evidence still has to go before a sheriff when we're talking about the imposition of an order. So I think that's really one for people to debate in the actual passage of the bill, whether the fine nuances of how it's worded and the criteria people are satisfied that it strikes that right balance between proportionate response and safety of the family. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If I may, convener, a supplementary to Dr. Scott, and we are talking specifically about the notices here, Dr. Scott. Scottish Women's Aid were very closely involved in the drafting of the bill. What can we read into your expected frequency of use of notices and the issue of proportionality? I mean, what percentage of reported cases would you envisage that a notice would be put in place for?
That's really difficult to answer, John, in part because I think it starts to address the whole blurry area of women who choose not to report at this point because it feels unsafe to them. And certainly other provisions in the bill, we hear all the time about women not reporting because they're concerned about the consequences of homelessness. So I think I think it's still going to be a relatively small proportion. This is not, the notices are not going to be issued, in our view, routinely by police, because routinely, hopefully, there will be evidence for arrest and for a criminal charge. The other issue where we do think we'll see might be in cases where there's an investigation, evidence is put to the Crown chooses not to prosecute because there's insufficient evidence, but the police still have strong concerns about the safety of the family. And in that case, this will be a critical tool that's not available at this point. And I suspect that we'll see, at least initially, use of the notices in those cases fairly consistently, because obviously the police would not have reported to the Crown if they didn't think that there was a safety issue.
Okay, thank you very much, panel. That's very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, John. Liam Kerr is going to pick up the questioning from here, and after Liam, it will be Fulton McGregor. Liam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'll direct my question to Dr. Marcia Scott in the first instance, and then other panel members come in if they feel they have something to contribute. In the written submission of Police Scotland, Marcia, they suggested that if the police can issue a DAPN without the usual multi-agency involvement in decision-making, this might not be positive. What they suggest is that the bill's approach wasn't in step with the usual partnership approach. Now, last week this committee heard from the bill team that multi-agency working didn't need to be enshrined in statute because it would just kind of happen in practice. So, Dr. Scott, what's your view? Are Police Scotland's concerns valid? And if so, how could we address that?
I have to say, good morning, Liam. I have to say that I was quite surprised by that because our experience is that police rarely engage with multi-agency structures in an initial call. the kinds of situations in which a notice would be served. However, we really value multi-agency work because we think it brings more information to everybody's decision making. But multi-agency working takes time, and this notice process is about a short-term intervention that then gets scrutinized by the court, and that subsequent scrutiny can be informed by multi-agency information. But I don't think the use of a notice avoids the input from multi-agency settings like MARACS. It comes later in the process.
Right. So if I can just reflect that back, so you are comfortable with how the bill has presented this, then, in terms of effectively giving the police the discretion on the ground at the time to decide, okay, have we got time to do multi-agency working? Have we got, will it be productive, or actually do we just need to crack on and do what we need to do? Are you comfortable with the current approach then?
Our understanding is what you've described is what happens now. So the idea that somehow a police officer is going to wait to knock on a door after a police call to call the local multi-agency organization, which meets probably a couple times a month, to consult them about whether they should use a notice or not, makes no sense to me.
I understand. Thank you for that. Tam or Lindsay, do you want to contribute to that, or shall I throw back to the convener?
I have nothing further to add.
Yes, I do. Oh, damn it. Hold on.
Please.
Sorry, wait a minute. Actually, I do want to contribute, but I can't get my heart to work just now.
All right, Tam, we can hear you.
Dan,
how can I go? Sorry, I'm taking up valuable time here. Yes, the notices are like very quick, very short. The police are first responders in the vast majority of protection cases in Scotland, and that includes children and it includes adults. So there's nothing unusual about the police having to act as a single agency. I can say that in child protection, though, they're right to point out the multi-agency approach. There's a thing called initial referral discussions that happen very quickly when there are concerns about children. The police are one of three key members, the others being social work and health. And I would expect that where there were concerns with regard to children that are involved in notices, that would certainly be brought to the attention in terms of the IRD process, which has been really strongly endorsed right now through the review of child protection guidance in Scotland. So it may be that there's different timescales for MARAC consideration, but in terms of children, there's a very short timescale between the initial incident and this being brought to the attention of other relevant agencies. And that actually forms the bedrock of our child protection processes in Scotland right now. Thank you. Sorry about that messing around at the beginning.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much, Tam. That's a very helpful set of clarifications. Okay, I'm going to move to Fulton McGregor now, please, and after Fulton, it will be Annabel Ewing. Fulton.
Thanks, convener, and good morning, panel. My question is really following up from where Liam Kerr was talking about in terms of multi-agency working, and moving on to referring of a person at risk to support organisations. And I'm just wondering if you think that a presumption to refer a person to support services might be a worthy addition to the bill. Do you think that this happens routinely just now? I heard different views there from panel members in terms of the multi-agency working. So this is a wee bit different again. Do you think that referrals, when necessary, happen regularly, or do you think a presumption in the bill to refer a person to support services might be useful? If I could start with Dr. Scott first, if that's okay.
Yeah, Thank you for giving me a chance to say something I wanted to say, which is that, obviously consent and risk and access to services are all complex interactions in what actually happens on the ground. I think our conviction is that it's not so much whether a referral is made, but it's how and when a referral is made. So what we would support perhaps is, rather than a presumption, it would be maybe an opt-out arrangement. And we've seen this certainly in some of the local policing arrangements in which an opt-out referral to a women's aid service is essentially what we call a warm referral. So it says, we have this service, our practice, because we think they offer a really helpful support to you, is you to them, but you have control over this, and if for whatever reason you object to that, then we won't do it. But our assumption is that we will otherwise. And I think that gives a really strong message that this support service is going to welcome this contact without taking control out of the hands of women. And there's two reasons why that's important, I think. One is it's really important to understand that if you look at all the risk assessment research and literature across decades, essentially what it says is that women are the best predictor of future harm. So if you do an intervention with an accused, and you want to know how he's going to respond, the best way to figure that out is to ask the victim. And so there may well be some complex interplay of factors in whether she takes up a referral or not. And it still needs to be in her control. But the reality is that if that referral is not made in a timely fashion, so we have evidence that says that if you offer a victim survivor a referral within the first 24 hours of her contact with police, she is something like 90% more likely to take it up than if she gets it after the fact. And I do think that there's some really good practice, a lot of really good practice, because we have some really good relationships with police across Scotland with women's aid services. But the reality is that it's choppy and it's uneven. And I think there's an opportunity here in the bill to make it absolutely crystal clear what good practice looks like.
Thanks for that, Dr. Scott. I think that's a really good overview. Lindsay Monaghan, have you got anything to add to this? And I'm wondering if you could comment specifically on if you think a presumption to referral would be useful.
Yeah, of course, Dawn. In terms of the presumption, I would probably echo what Marcia's said there. I think that it's important to put that decision into women's hands and not to force that upon a woman, but to have an opportunity for them to opt out would be a better way. In terms of having that and needing that support, I think that the support services that are available are invaluable. The experience that we get of women who contact our helplines, so our helplines and surgeries are sometimes the first point of contact for women who have stumbled across our number and may phone up. And what we find is that when a woman hasn't already engaged with a support service like Women's Aid, quite often there's a higher risk for that woman as they present to us. And we're a legal service, so we're giving advice about protective orders, about the criminal justice process. And so I can only imagine that it would be invaluable to women to have that information and to be able to access that at that immediate point of risk. And Women's Aid can do the relevant risk assessments and ensure that the woman has the practical support that she needs. So certainly I agree that that's something that is needed. I also would just comment on, for example, when a woman goes through the criminal justice process, the police should be making referrals and giving information about victim support, and we see the benefit of that. So when a woman has been referred to something like victim support at that point, quite often they have a lot more information about the process, but where that fails, so where a woman perhaps doesn't get the information, or as Dr. Scott said, later on in the process gets that information, the women usually don't engage as much, or they don't understand what's going on in the process. So yes, I think it is important, and perhaps not a presumption it's going to happen, but that being at the police disposal, I think is very important.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. Tam Bailey, would you want to come in on this question as well?
Yeah, just briefly, I think it makes sense to have something in the bill with regard to assessment of need and where appropriate supportive services to be provided. I would be careful with regard to presumption, and the reason I say that on this one is that in the early 2000s there was a presumption that all referrals of children involved in situations of domestic abuse would be referred on to the reporter. And that practice over many years nearly brought our reporter service to a standstill. And there's now other ways of ensuring that services get to children. And if we're talking about assessment of needs and support services, I think it should be for all parties. So that would be the women who are most often on the receiving end, the children, and also the perpetrator. Because what you want to do is if this is going to have long-lasting impact, you want to make sure that you're minimising any recurrence of future incidents. So I think that issue of assessment and support goes right across the board for all parties that are involved in this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Tam. I think that's actually a very interesting point that you raise, and obviously there is good programmes and work out there, as you'll know about the Change programme, the Caledonia programme, and many others. And actually that's another good way to look at it. I wonder whether it's something for the committee to pick up in terms of support services, a presumption for support services for perpetrators as well, because there is some good programmes there. Thanks a lot. That's me, convener.
Thank you very much, Fulton. I see Marcia wants to come back in, but if you don't mind, Marcia, perhaps you can wrap whatever it is you want to say in response to that into your answer to Annabel Ewing's questions, because I think Annabel wants to pick up on some of these closely related themes. So over to you, Annabel, and then after Annabel, it'll be Shona Robertson, please. Thank you.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, colleagues and panel. I have two key questions to ask, but I might change the order around because it would flow better with the discussion we've just had. And looking at the process of the DAPN and the DAPO, as things currently stand in terms of the drafting of the bill, it is not a requirement to obtain the consent of the victim. Could I ask for your views on the ruled out that this would happen perhaps as the norm, but it would allow for exceptions where, for whatever reason, it was not deemed appropriate? But can I just, what is your basic response to the current approach on this very important issue? Perhaps I could start with Marcia.
I think, like all of us, we understand that there's a balancing here in terms of risk and agency, but I think we need to maximize options, and I think this refers back to what I was just saying about women being the best predictors of their risk. So we totally understand in terms of notices that we would want the police to seek the views, to be required to seek the views of women, and when possible of children. We are clear that in those circumstances, consent will be less easy to rely on, and not necessarily a feature of the notice. When we get to the orders, however, we have strong concerns about orders that are made without the consent or even directly opposing the wills and wishes of women. And I think that refers back to what we were saying about women being the best predictor of their own harm. And also I'll refer to Patrick Downing's testimony about the whole process working better if a woman is supporting of it. However, I think that we need flexibility in the system. If there is, if the court is convinced that the woman is being coerced, or if we all have a duty of care, and if there's really clear evidence that there is imminent danger to the child, to the children of the women involved, I think we need to build that flexibility in. But the more that we can do to assure that the court does more than have regard when they're aware of, but actually is required to seek the views and to listen to the input of women and children, the better this whole system will work.
I thank Marcia for that answer, and perhaps I could turn to Lindsay but ask the supplementary question. I mean, in some circumstances, how would this actually work if the consent had not been given? Because I understand that the notice, say, for example, DAPN is to be served where the perpetrator resides. So I'm just wondering how it is foreseen that in some cases, perhaps more the cases in extremis, but nonetheless, there would be likely to be some cases where that could be a very difficult scenario, where you have the perpetrator being served with the DAPN in the home where he, in most cases, resides with the victim, and the victim is not really part of this process. Perhaps Lindsay could comment on that.
Yes, Annabella, I agree. I think that's a dangerous situation that could occur, and I think that's why, and that's one of the reasons why views must be inbuilt into the process. So taking the views of the women and also the children, where appropriate and age appropriate, into the process. I think that the issue with the DAPN is that it's a short-term emergency protective order for women's safety. And so it's our position that views should be taken at that point. However, consent might not be possible. So it's accepted that consent just might not be possible at that stage. However, if views are taken about the safety and the risk, as Marcia said, women are champions of their own risk assessment, and they know best what's safe to happen, and that's something that we quite often try to embody through our practice, is that women know their own risk. They know, or they know their abuser. They know their abuser best. They know what's likely to happen, and so if they're able to inform the process, then it creates and it makes a safer process. I would suggest that in terms of the order, it's a longer term order, and indeed we consider it potentially should be longer than it is proposed, but certainly it's a longer term order, and therefore consent at that point makes more sense. So it makes more sense to take consent, because that is going to have longer and more wider reaching impact upon the women. In terms of the risk of the abuser still being in the home, then the hope would be that where that's obviously one of the intentions of the bill. So the hope is that the abuser will be removed or be not allowed to return. So that would hopefully save that risk. But certainly the women would be the best place to inform that and explain. What we often see is through the criminal justice process is that women's views and their position is often not regarded throughout that process, and that's one of the biggest complaints that we hear through our helplines and surgeries, through our outreach, is that women just don't feel as though they're involved in the process, or they're heard, and it's an access to justice issue when you don't feel as though that process is really involving you, and so we would hate for that to happen or be reflected in this bill.
Thank you for that comprehensive response, Lindsay. Before I turn to my second question, which I'll address principally to Tam Bailey, could I just ask quickly then, do you feel the bill as currently drafted reflects what you've just said in terms of the desired policy intention from your perspective? Lindsay? No,
because the bill doesn't, it says that you don't need consent. And views, although they are within it, that should be taken. If it's really clear that consent is not needed, especially for the order, then consent it potentially won't be taken. And so I think it has to be clearer. I think it has to be clearer that the women's views should be, built into that process.
Great, thank you very much for that. If I could turn to Tam Bailey for my second question, although if he's got any comment to make on that issue, that's absolutely fine. And it's dealing with the issue of the fact that, looking at the scope of the bill from the perspective of the threshold set, which are age thresholds. So for the perpetrator, it is 18, whereas for the victim, it is 16. I wonder if Pam has any comment on that.
I mean, I think this reflects the mixed position that we've got with regard to children and adult. We're about to move, as I mentioned earlier, to children being regarded as under 18 under UNCRC, but you still have situations where 16 plus can be householders, for instance. So we've got rather mixed legislation in Scotland in that 16, 17-year-old age bracket. So I think the bill has to try and reflect situations where we're trying to maximise the safety of the people who are caught in positions of domestic abuse. It's not satisfactory, but it's more a reflection of other legislation that we've got around that particular age group. And if can I just add a little bit to what was said before with regard to consent, because I think this is a bill about imposition of police and court on families' situation. And there's an advantage in it being a police action that takes the weight of responsibility from the mother in most instances with regard to the notice. But as soon as you move into things that are longer term, such as the order, it's basically unworkable unless you actually do have consent. There's a little bit about how it appears as well, who's taking the initiative, how the mother in particular can maintain the safety for herself and the family if it's imposed by the court. So rather than her actually having to take the initiative with regard to the court action. So there's a little bit of appearances there, but I do agree that the longer term the order, the more you're going to need consent and views of consistent with the imposition of that order. Sorry, I should have answered that the other way around. But
Thank you. Thanks very much, and that's fine for me for the moment, convener. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Annabelle. But Marcia, did you want to come back in on any of that? You indicated, I think, on the chat box that you did. Marcia?
Yeah, just really quickly, what I should have also shared with the committee is that women are the best predictor of their future harm, but they're not good predictors of homicide. So the Homicide in Britain study done by the Doboshes made it clear that women who are partners or ex-partners did not see that coming, and so we need something that is suitable when the danger is that high. And I would just remind everybody that coercive and controlling behaviors is one of the few signals we have when abuse is more likely to be to move into lethality. And I think that so therefore it's less concerning to us that consent's not required for the notice. And I'll just fall back on what we've all said about the orders.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much. I think Shona Roberson's going to pick up the questioning from here, and then after Shona, it'll be Rhoda Grant. Shona.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, panel. We have touched on this already a couple of times, and that is the issue of taking a person at risk views, both in terms of the draft and how the system might operate in practice. As you know, and we've touched on already, the provision in the bill at the moment is that the person at risk views should be taken into account for an order to be made or extended. So I guess what I'd like to come to Marcia first around the issue of whether the wording should be changed. I think you referred earlier on to requiring the views to be taken rather than seeking the views. Should that be changed explicitly in the bill, and how might that operate in practice? So if I could come to Marsha first, then Lindsay. Thank you.
What we're seeking is, so language is about that the court has to pay attention to the views when they're aware of them. And we're concerned that that is too big of a loophole, frankly. And we'd quite like to see something that requires the court to seek the views and to pay attention to them when they can get them. And I think that that's a different process with children. And I think I really want to underscore that we need to be careful about how that is done. But we have lots of new language in the Children's Scotland Bill that talks about children's participation and sets some principles around it. And I look forward to the day when our courts know how to do that. And I think every single piece of legislation that we can that can enshrine children's right to participate in decisions that are made about their lives and to participate safely, we should. So I guess all I'm saying is that we need to change the language to make it stronger and to make it clear that we expect all elements of the justice system to seek the views of both the women and the children. And I suppose in a way, a bit like a default. So if you haven't got the views, why not?
Okay, Lindsay, could you maybe say how you think that might work a little bit more in practice when we come to you, if we could come to you next? Thank you.
For Shona, I think that for the notice, at the moment, it states that consent doesn't require to be taken, and so I think it would have to be really clear in the notice that views must be taken. So views must be taken to inform the process. So I think it has to be clearer, and I think and like we're saying, it's really important that views do inform that aspect, and we agree that consent may be too difficult at that stage. That's the ideal, is getting a woman's consent, but it may not be possible with the short-term nature of that order. But that views must be taken. And in terms of the order, that if consent is taken, and then in terms of what the sheriff must take into account, because we think that the women's views should inform the whole process. I would just echo exactly as Marsha has said, that rather than if they are available, that views should be taken. And if that's a question of timing, then the order requires to be longer lasting to allow that to take place. It's really crucial that a woman's views are taken, a victim impact statement or something that the sheriff can have and take account of, or at least or a woman to be able to appear at the hearings if they so choose. I think there requires to be something more substantial in that section also.
Lindsay, would it be reasonable to have something like reasonable steps taken to elicit those views? Because there may be circumstances where the views just cannot be taken. So, there would need to be some kind of caveat that if the views could not be taken, that things could proceed, but that all reasonable steps were taken to elicit the views. Is that something you would be comfortable with?
Yeah, or at least views taken where possible. I think that it's just that there has to be a requirement, but that there will always be circumstances perhaps where a woman is incapable of providing their views, or just it's clear that she doesn't want to provide her views, but wants things to continue on. That may be a case. I think that most women will want to be involved in that process and have a say, but certainly there will be, as you say, times when a woman may not want to or is incapable of doing that, and that should take account of that to make sure the orders can still be put in place.
Okay, thank you. Tam, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I want to add from a perspective of children. So in contact arrangements, for instance, Sheriff, it's appealable if children over the age of 12's views haven't been taken. So you might have some provision like that. But I have to say that the feedback from sheriffs and the quality of the information that they have to go on is not always what they would deem appropriate for the level of decision making. We've got a long way to go. Thankfully, we're making progress, but we've got a long way to go to be assured that we're taking the views of children involved in court processes appropriately. And the other thing is about the age and stage of children. and we shouldn't presume that children under the age of 12 don't have a view, but there's a declining rate of views given to the court for children who are under 12, the younger they are. And of course, there are real difficulties in getting the views of children who are, say, under the age of 5, who tend to act out their behaviour rather than be able to articulate it. But all of this leads up to, takes time. And it takes time to get alongside a child to actually have confidence in them being able to, first of all, express their views to you, but also for you to be confident in what the child's actually saying. So the length of the orders just now, sorry, I've mentioned this previously, but 2 months with a 1 month extension for me really is too short a period to be able to, for the courts to come to a reasonable view on that. So I think there are real challenges. I've got no doubt that the wording could be strengthened with regard to a requirement to take views. But the key thing, I think, is a consideration of the age and stage of the children and the length of time that it might take to get alongside that child to be able to confidently express those views. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's me, convener. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shona. We've got about 20 minutes left for this panel, and we've still got questions from Rhoda and from Liam Kerr and from John Finney. But if we keep at this pace, we should get through it all. So with that, over to you, Rhoda, to pick up the questioning from here. Thanks.
Thank you. I've heard what the witnesses have said about taking the views of the child. And I think it was Women's Aid that said that the Children's Scotland Act 2020 should be the model for that. And I'm just wondering, having heard what you said, is that what is the agreement of the panel? Or are people thinking that possibly child welfare isn't the paramount consideration in this bill, and should that be slightly different? I'll go to Marcia first, I think, given Women's Aid have stated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's already some language about using advocates or supporters to help consult essentially with and seek the views, get the views, and you know, as we all know, children in our young experts group for the Children's Scotland Bill were really clear that absolutely critical to their ability to participate in the system would be to have an adequate supporter. I think the paramount interest of children needs to always be the bar by which we make decisions, and or that the interests of children be paramount. And I'm not sure I'm actually answering your question, Rhoda, so I apologize for that. But I guess what I would say is it's a factor in for children to make their views heard. We know the new Children's Scotland bills, you know, there's no presumption against children at a young age, but we need to have the supports in place for them to then articulate what their views are. Again, children's workers and Women's Aid can tell you that, you know, I totally support what Tam is saying, that this is not something that you can have you can't whisk a 7-year-old into chambers and have the sheriff ask them what they think and think that anybody's going to get a reliable response to that. It really needs to be done with and by with children and by the supporters who they trust and have a relationship with them. And similarly for adult victims, you know, and this goes back to the referral question, which have to do with making sure you make a timely referral so that by the time the court is seeking the views of a woman, she has had the support and counsel that she needs.
Okay, can I just push you a little further? In places like Australia and New Zealand, children are able to access these orders and protections in their own right. Do you think that would be worthwhile considering under this bill?
I think it's a really difficult question because I always want children to have more rights rather than fewer. I think, however, that in the particular framing of this emergency order, that the reality of children's lives is that their safety in emergency situations often depends on the safety of their mother, and that the single most important intervention we can do is to make sure that their mothers are safe, because their mothers are the most protective factor for the children. Over the longer period, complex and nuanced response, but in an emergency situation, I think that we blur the areas of whose danger. So it's very often, our system has for decades discounted how much harm comes to children because they think that somehow they're not harmed by what's happening to their mother, either because similar controls or coercion or abuse is happening to them, but it's invisible in the way our system takes evidence, but also because harm to mothers is harm to children. And so I think that with all of the factors, being weighed, I do think that this is the appropriate way to go, and that we have child protection processes that would be for use for children. And also one quick addition, which is one of the things that would make this less urgent, children being able to have an order of their own, would be if children actually had real access to justice rather than just on paper. We all know that children have a right to legal representation, and yet, that right is barely discernible in the system. And I would say that there is an area where we should actually explore how to improve access to that right, which will help assuage some of our concerns about children not being able to raise an order on their own behalf.
Okay, thank you. Tam, do you want to comment on that, and maybe where we could access a best practice for getting the views of children in a way that gets their real views and doesn't cause them any harm?
Yeah, okay. There's two things I want to say before I come to that. One is that there's a movement afoot in Scotland with regard to trauma-informed practice, and essentially we're talking about children that have been living through traumatising situations. So hopefully we will be better attuned to how we support children who are living through this. The second thing is in terms of advocacy, and I really welcome the discussion and the progress that we're making with regard to supporting children. I see little point in having children having some agency within the bill unless we're prepared to support it. But that's not to say that I don't welcome it. We've got very few bits of legislation in Scotland where children actually have a sense of, or actually have a right of agency. Probably the additional support for learning bill is one of the earliest examples, but very few others. So if the committee were minded to be really strengthening the position of children through the bill, then I would welcome that. In terms of good practice, we have lots and lots of examples of good practice of supporting children. But I have to say that in my experience, for instance, children that have been supported who are going through court cases with regard to child abuse, the courts sometimes have called on that counselling and support in terms of evidence. So that actually mitigates against getting some early support to children. So while I welcome all of that in terms of the focus on the views and strengthening the rights of children through the bill, it would have to be accompanied by confidence or requirement for support to be given to children routinely who are caught in situations of domestic abuse. And that would be different from where we're at just now, because not all children get that support. So that's a yes, but there's other things that have to go along with that. And I'm not coming equipped today, Rhoda, with any particular examples. And I'm reluctant to say I will, but I will if I can. For the record, then I would be more than happy to try and find good examples of where children's views have been given in court situations where we could point to that as an example of good practice in Scotland. I don't know. That's quite reckless.
Okay, Lindsay, do you have anything to add?
No, nothing further to add. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Rhoda. In that case, I think we'll move to Liam Kerr. Rhoda, if you're finished with your questions. Liam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning again, panel. I'll direct my first question, or my question, to Lindsay first, if I may. And this is about Section 8 of the bill, about the making of a domestic abuse protection order. Now, as drafted, the police, but nobody else, can apply to the Sheriff Court for one of these orders. Now, that is in contrast to the proposed approach in England and Wales, where potentially a person at risk or the local authority could also apply. And I noticed that it also contrasts with the approach in the FGM protection order. Now, the committee heard last week from the Bill team that the Scottish Government views is that this is appropriate to limit it to the police. So, Lindsay, first, what's your view? Should the power to apply for one of these orders be extended beyond the police? If so, to whom? And how could a joined-up approach be assured?
Yes, so I consider that the police are an appropriate body to be able to do these the domestic abuse protection notices and also the orders. However, we also consider that it should be broadened in terms of the order of who can apply for these, and specifically speaking about local authorities. So considering statutory services, health, social work, following on from like MARAC assessments and housing officers and things like that, being able to assess the need. And the real reason for that is that quite often women will present at these services as having difficulties with domestic abuse, and this is quite often the first port of call, and therefore either these services being able to apply for the order or being able to at least make referrals through the police would be important, we consider, for women's safety and ensuring greater access to justice for women. The only thing I would say is I understand that this would cause a significant resource strain upon local authorities, and therefore it may be we've suggested that referrals are more appropriate, but appropriate funding would have to be put in place for services across the board for this, including support services, and appropriate training and resources. And understanding of domestic abuse is really important for police, for local authorities and for anybody else involved.
Thank you for that. Before I throw that same question to Marcia Scott, just on that resource point, if I may press you, Lindsay, because personally I think that's a good point you've made about the resource implications if you expand this. Does that not also then suggest that we need to think very carefully about the resource implications on the police? If they, as it stands, they have the power to make this application, do we need to be considering some very serious resource questions around that?
Oh, most certainly. I mean, there has to be adequate resources and funding put in place to ensure that the bill is adequately rolled out. That starts from training and understanding, and police and anybody else who's allowed to put in place these orders having an understanding of risk assessment and ensuring that they can put these orders and notices in place safely, and that's where it would start. But it also has to be rolled out in terms of officers being able to actually implement it and having the time and the resource to be able to do that in order for this to be a successful bill. So yeah, certainly.
Marcia Scott, do you have anything to add to what Lindsay's just told us?
I do. I would say, well, we share pretty much 100% of the same concern. Down on the side of preferring police, and I think obviously that that local authorities, that social work officers, that other agencies, housing could refer to police and request one. But I think my concern is for the unintended negative consequences of opening this up to people without necessarily, to people in roles that are not necessarily required that they have appropriate training. And what I'm imagining here is, so we know that one of the biggest miscarriages of justice that happens in our system is when a victim seeks safety and gets arrested mistakenly as a perpetrator. And I'm very happy to see that in the first year of the Domestic Abuse Act, that under Section 1 of the coercive control elements, that we are, as we suggested, that the evidence would suggest that something like 4% of the perpetrators are female. What we know in usual, and Scotland needs to take credit for that, because that's quite an unusual thing, because in most places where you change arrest policy, you see spikes in mistaken arrests of women as perpetrators. What I would really worry about if we broaden this out beyond police is that really well-intended elements of the rest of the community would be seeking notices without really understanding who the likely primary aggressor is. And I think we have really good protocols in place with police, between police and the Crown Office, and training in place with police, and we can expect to do more training with police if they need it under this bill. I don't think that we have the capacity nor the, at this point, the scope for training the rest of the community who might want to be involved with this. And so the logical thing is at least to start with an entity that we know is likely to have the infrastructure to implement this appropriately, and to use them as the focal point for these, but absolutely to welcome multi-agency engagement with referring people to the police.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to intervene here. I'm sorry. Sorry, Liam. I'm going to intervene here. We're going to have to speed this up. I'm sorry. We've only got 3 minutes left for this panel. Marcia, that was a really important, but also a rather long answer. If we can have just really, really short, sharp, crisp questions and answers for the next couple of minutes. Liam, I think you're not quite finished yet. After Liam, it'll be John Finney, but very quickly, please, Liam.
I'm very grateful, Convener. Very quickly, Marcia, there's a slight tension, I think, in between what you've just said, which I think was we should limit it to police applying for orders, and your submission, which seems to say, or it does say, the Scottish Government should consider options for other professionals to be granted the authority to apply to court for an order. I'm just curious, am I mishearing you? Which should I prefer?
You're not mishearing me. I think you're hearing our ambivalence on this. I would really like to see other elements of the community be able to request these. I'm just not sure that the resources will be put in place in the bill that would allow that to happen without negative consequences. If there was a way that that could happen, we would support it. Sorry,
okay,
it's a bit like what Lindsay said, which is if you put the resources in, we could support it. If you don't, we can't.
That's very clear, and it's very clear that there's an ambivalence in that, which is actually quite helpful. Thank you, Marcia. John Finney, please.
I direct my question to Ms Monaghan, and it is about the interplay between the civil and criminal courts. Now, as configured at the moment, DPO can only be imposed by a civil court, not a criminal court. I wonder, Ms Monaghan, do you agree with that approach? And be interested in your views on the idea of the criminal court having powers to impose an order on sentencing, as well as perhaps even at earlier stages in the proceedings.
Thanks, John. I don't. It's not really something I can comment on. The criminal law is not my sphere. However, I agree with the face of the bill that it should be a civil order. I think that the civil courts have the appropriate kind of framework in place to take that through in terms of interim orders, etc. However, I don't think I have much more to add than that.
Okay, thanks. Briefly, Dr. Scott, if you have a differing view or on the potential benefits or otherwise of expanding that power to impose to criminal court?
Briefly, I think that the NHO process that is built into the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act is the more appropriate process, and I think it will. We know that it can be imposed for longer periods, and it should do what is said on the 10 for the protection orders. And I think that adding this civil process on to the criminal process would not be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Final question to Mr. Bailey, and it's a matter you touched on earlier, Mr. Bailey, and that is the duration of the orders. There's a view expressed, indeed, by Dr. Scott and Ms. Monaghan's organisations that the duration was potentially too short at 3 months, with the challenge of obtaining longer-term civil protective orders. If the bill were to be amended to make an order, a longer-term protective order, I wonder, would you accept that the government might have to revisit the evidential threshold which has to be met before it could be imposed by a court? Please.
The answer is yes to both. So I absolutely think that it's too short, but I do think that puts extra pressure on the evidential aspects of obtaining an order. But I think the prize is the stability for the family, for the women, for the children, and I think that would satisfy one of the main policy objectives, which is that the families stay put and the perpetrator is moved on. So I think it's really worthwhile the committee worrying away at this business of the timescale or the period of time for the order, because actually I think that more clearly fits, a longer order more clearly fits the policy intention as my reading of it, especially when we've talked about some of the limitations and the other measures that are available through the courts.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Scott, Ms. Monaghan, briefly, if you felt that this would, if the extension were to be put into place, whether that would impact on the evidential threshold required, please. Dr. Scott.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is safety. If, in fact, the opinion of the court is that that extending the order would increase the safety of the children of the women involved, then that needs to be the mechanism by which we decide how long it should be. And I don't think that somehow 4 months means that we need a higher threshold of evidence. I think it's really important to understand how slowly some around housing decisions, and that the system needs to run. The system needs to be based on safety, I think it's really important that we don't encourage courts to think that because a perpetrator hasn't reoffended in the 3 months that there's been an order, that you can assume that perpetrator is now no risk for children and women, because we have so much evidence that would not be true.
Okay, thank you all very much. That's very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to Tam Bailey, Marcia Scott and Lindsay Monaghan for your evidence this morning. I'm really sorry that this was rushed. I know it was a bit rushed, but we have 8 further witnesses to hear from today. So with that apology and our very grateful thanks, I hope you have as happy a Christmas as it's possible to have in these circumstances. We'll suspend for 5 minutes just to enable a changeover of witnesses, so we'll reconvene at 10:53. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our second panel of witnesses this morning. And we are joined now by Gillian Maudsley from the Law Society of Scotland, by Detective Chief Superintendent Sam McCluskey from Police Scotland, by Joan Tranent from Social Work Scotland, and by Professor Mandy Burton, who is a Professor of Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Leicester. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining the committee this morning. We have about 75 minutes for this panel, which is not quite long enough. It's never quite long enough, so we won't take opening statements from you. We'll just go straight to questions, if that's okay. And I'd like to open the question by asking, first of all, this. Given that the police and the criminal courts have existing powers available to them to restrict the movements of suspected perpetrators of abuse, is there a gap in existing protections and existing police and criminal court powers that a DAPN would address? And if I can ask that question firstly to Gillian Maudsley and then to Detective Chief Superintendent Sam McCluskey, please. So Gillian first.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think that is a very good question and a point that we've always stressed, that we completely are against any form of domestic violence. And if there is a gap in the legislation, then of course it's appropriate to constitute these orders. But at all points, including the policy memorandum, we have stressed, please give us the scenarios in which this would operate that are not already covered by various means and protections in the current law. So that would be the first point. And the second point is, if it is minded that these orders are appropriate, we think that there needs to be far more attention paid to their interaction with the criminal process and with the other existing measures that are available across the board, because over-proliferation can cause confusion and doesn't work in the interests of any party. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gillian. I might come back on something that you've just said there in a moment, but I want to hear from the other witnesses first, if I may. So can I ask the same question to Detective Chief Superintendent McCluskey, please?
Yeah, good morning. I think, similar to what's already been said, we would very much support anything that enables us to protect victims better. We don't necessarily see the gap, but I think there is a real acknowledgement from us that we could make better use of existing powers. And I think that the change in legislation recently, for example, the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act, and the training that officers have had to now recognise coercive control and the dynamics of domestic abuse, might actually start to impact on that.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. So no gap in the current law, but a gap in training and use of the current law is what I think I heard you say there.
I think that the training that we've delivered is good. It was excellent, very well received, and the feedback was very good. And I think we've seen a shift in attitudes on how we actually approach domestic abuse from a policing perspective. I think that previously it would be fair to say that we haven't used existing powers that we do have to their full extent in terms of domestic abuse, but hopefully that's changing now. And I think what we see this piece of legislation is an exceptional tool for use in exceptional circumstances, but shouldn't be the routine response.
Okay, thank you. Professor Burton, is there a gap in existing Scots law? And if so, is this the way to fill it? Sorry, you have to, can somebody unmute Professor Burton's microphone, please? Sorry, Professor Burton, start again. Thanks.
Hello. Yes, I think there is a gap in the protection that's offered, and that is short-term protection that can be provided by the police. Of course, at the moment, the police have powers under the criminal law, but these orders are civil orders, and that's where the gap can be filled, because victims can get long-term civil protection themselves, or they can get remedies from the police under the criminal law. But what they can't get at the moment is a short-term civil protective order, and that's the gap that's being filled by these orders.
Okay, thank you, Professor Burton. And finally on this question, Joan Tranent, please. I can't hear Joan Tranent. Is her microphone unmuted? I can't hear her at all. So can I ask Broadcasting and IT to fix the connection with Joan Tranent? I'm sorry, Joan, we'll have to come back to you. We'll have to fix that problem. Can I go back to Gillian Maudsley and ask her to reflect on what she's heard from the other witnesses in relation to this question? Gillian, what I heard you say was that we shouldn't be legislating here unless there is a gap. But I'm not sure if we really heard your view as to whether or not there is a gap that needs to be fixed in this way or not. Gillian?
Thank you. I think the difficulty is that there isn't a substantial gap that we can see. The circumstances in which it would appear that the notice would operate is that short-term situation where there is insufficient evidence for the police to arrest somebody, a perpetrator. And in these circumstances, it seems that this notice would be used as a means of protection. In that very limited circumstance, there is perhaps an emergency or a short-term measure that is not currently covered. But how often or where that would exactly occur, and I think there is a lack of clarity within the bill, I think needs to be resolved. So it's not that we think there's actually a gap as much as there may be a very specific short-term situation. I'm reflecting the kind of Thursday to Sunday scenario that perhaps could come to mind, but we can reflect on that in more detail if required during the evidence session.
Thank you, Gillian. That's a really helpful clarification. Can I just pick up on something that you said in your first answer, which was about the relationship, the interaction between these provisions and other alternatives to custody or parole requirements, which already exist in the criminal justice system in Scotland. So, for example, and this is a point I put to the Bill team last week, where a person is required to remain a minimum distance from their home, such as, for example, with regard to electronic tagging arrangements. Is this an issue, that's to say the interaction between DAPNs and DAPOs and the rest of the criminal justice system, is this an issue which needs to be directly addressed in the bill, in your view, or would addressing it through guidance be sufficient?
The bill should obviously, as you can imagine, the reply from us will be primary legislation should be as clear as possible. And I think there are gaps within the legislation that do need to be made much clearer as the bill progresses through the Parliament. I don't think they're a matter of guidance, because if the issues arise and we're looking at them now, they really do need to be sorted where they can. Guidance obviously is appropriate, and the police officer, senior police officer, is already reflecting the fact of training and education and awareness is a very, very important component, and guidance certainly, for instance, in section 18 is clearly appropriate, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that there shouldn't be guidance on Police Scotland's website too, but primarily where these gaps are, I would be supporting let's sort them out within the primary legislative forum where these exist, and certainly the Sheriffs Association, I think faculty and ourselves are united that there are areas and sections that do require clarification.
Thank you. Professor Burton, do you have anything you want to add to this aspect of our questioning?
Yes, thank you. I think it's very important where you've got orders that are interacting with other provisions, albeit under the criminal law or civil or family law, that there is some provision for which orders are going to take priority, particularly if there's any conflict. So I think it's very important that there's a joined up approach and that the family is seen holistically, so that any measures that are being taken either under the criminal or other aspects of law are working and putting in the same direction.
Thank you. And Detective Chief Superintendent McCluskey, please.
Absolutely welcome clarity to be in the legislation itself, because ultimately Police Scotland will be held accountable for how we apply this legislation. So guidance to me would not be sufficient. I think we would really seek clarity in the primary legislation.
Okay, that's a really helpful steer from all of you. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we don't have Joan Tranent with us at the moment, but we are hoping that we will be able to reconnect with her in short order. So I'm going to ask Rhoda Grant to pick up the questioning from here, and then after Rhoda, it will be Shona Robertson. Rhoda.
Thank you. Just following that question, we understand the orders and notices take precedence over court orders regarding children, access arrangements and child protection orders. Do you believe that approach is correct? And secondly, like the last question, should that be explicit on the face of the bill or should it be in guidance? And I can ask, is Sam McCluskey? I can.
The guidance.
Sorry, Sam, could you start again? Your microphone was unmuted.
Yeah, I think once again we would ask for that to be explicit in the guidance. We're asking police officers on the ground to respond to emergency situations, and we're also asking them to risk assess and make judgment calls on matters that are potentially going to be countering court-imposed orders, and it needs to be really clear what takes primacy there. And I don't think that's necessarily for us. I think it needs to be explicit in the legislation itself.
Okay, thank you. Mandy Burton, is that the approach taken in the UK domestic abuse bill, or could we learn something from that?
I think we've got quite a lot to learn potentially from the approach in England and Wales. Last year, the government set up a review of harm in child arrangement proceedings because of a huge body of research which shows that this is a problem internationally, that there is a risk of harm resulting from pro-contact presumptions in domestic abuse cases, and that there is now a large body of empirical evidence which suggests that the question of harm in child contact cases needs to be taken seriously, and the government, at least for England and Wales, has put in train new processes for dealing with the risk of harm in child arrangement cases. But what we have to remember about emergency barring orders are that they are a short-term remedy. So if there is a conflict between a child arrangement order and an emergency barring order, in my view, because it's a short-term remedy, the priority should be given to the emergency barring order to protection of the family in the short term, and then revisiting of the child contact arrangements in the longer order, in the domestic abuse protection order, would be appropriate. But in terms of the notice, certainly priority, in my view, should be given to the emergency protection, because we're dealing with a very short period of time. And in most cases, there won't be a child arrangement order in place anyway, because the parties will still be together, and that's why the protection notice is being issued. So I think that it would be helpful if the legislation did clarify that priority be given to the protection notice over any child arrangements.
Okay. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Rhoda. I think we're now joined again by Joan Tranent from Social Work Scotland. So can I just test, Joan, that you can hear us and that we can hear you? Nope, I'm afraid we can't hear Joan. That doesn't seem to be working. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on, and Shona Robeson, I think, is going to pick up the questioning from here. Shona.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, Shona, I can hear you.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, convener. Good morning, panel. I want to ask about the tests set out in sections 4, 8 and 10 of the bill relating to the imposition of a DAPN and the granting of a DAPO and an interim DAPO. I want to ask the panel if any of the panel are unclear or unhappy about the effect of the test changes on the face of the legislation that you wish to suggest, or further training and guidance, whether that would be enough to address any concerns. I'll come to Gillian Maudsley first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Robson. I think that it's quite a wide question, and I'm not quite sure where to start. There are some concerns, for instance, as to exactly when the police and in what practical circumstances the police, for instance, would be issuing a notice I mean, I can expand on that in due course, because I have some difficulty in exactly when it's a senior police officer exercising discretion, just how that's going to happen and how that's going to be done on the alleged perpetrator. I think there was an issue raised about the burden of proof and what standard of proof this should be, which I think could benefit from clarification. Although these are civil, it doesn't necessarily always imply that it must be the civil standard. If it was felt that the criminal standard was appropriate, that could be set in. So I think these are kind of two aspects. There's probably more, but perhaps that's enough, and I can expand as required as the others pick up on your question, if that's okay.
Yeah, and because of the lack of time, if there's anything you want to add beyond your written statement, you could perhaps write to the committee with more detail on that. That might be helpful. Can I come to Samantha McCluskey on that question about the test, please?
Yes, I think Police Scotland similarly had concerns around the threshold. I know that much of the research work was done on the England and Wales model, where the threshold was considered by many to be too high. I think in this case, the threshold is potentially a little bit too wide, and we would welcome further discussion on where the threshold might be. There's no component element of risk within Section 4, and I think that's really important, because these are, people are using the term emergency orders. They're emergency orders. The police officer's decisions will be risk-based. Absolutely, that's correct. But we would have, I think what we see now has morphed slightly from the intention at the start for emergency banning orders, where it was focused on cohabited, for example, couples who cohabit, and now it isn't. It's very wide. And also, the legislation covers a single instance, whereas the Domestic Abuse Act, the DASA Act, covers a course of conduct, which enables officers to make a holistic assessment of the circumstances and, of course, then identify primary perpetrators. So we would absolutely welcome more clarity in the legislation on the threshold.
And that, you think, should be on the face of the legislation rather than in guidance?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Professor Burton, anything to add to what's been said?
Gillian's remark that it will be possible to have a criminal standard of proof for what is a civil order. And I would question whether the consequences of that would be helpful, because if you were to adopt a criminal standard to the making of the order, then there'd be little point in having the emergency barring orders, because they wouldn't be filling a gap that has been identified. And the gap that's been identified is where the police can't take action under the criminal law and offer protections via bail, for example. So
Oh, it looks like we've lost Professor Burton as well, unless it's just me. But I think
Perhaps Professor Burton could follow up in writing with anything that we've not heard, and just I'm aware of time, so that's me finished. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Although we might have a bit of time in hand now, given that we've now only got 2 witnesses in this panel rather than the planned 4, but we're hoping to reconnect with both Joan and with Mandy. But fortunately, John Finney's questions, and John Finney is next, John Finney's questions are principally for the witnesses who are still with us. John.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Convener, and good morning, panel, and thanks for your contributions, both in writing and thus far. I have a question for Detective Chief Superintendent McCluskey, and as legislators, Chief Superintendent, we obviously want to give the practitioners the best tools to operate with, and what we're trying to understand is the circumstances that will prevail at the scene of a domestic abuse incident, and in particular with regard to counter complaints and allegations. Can you say, and I appreciate that that's a common thing that the police have to deal with, can you say how that would relate to what we're discussing today, please?
Oh, come on. Sorry, can somebody please unmute the... Thank you.
I think the circumstances in which the police would envisage issuing a notice and then subsequently applying for an order would be very much where somebody has reported domestic abuse and we would be removing the perpetrator from the address in order to facilitate that investigation, and where we have some insufficient evidence to charge somebody and we would have to release them, but we assess that there is still significant risk to the person at home and any children within that home, and that we were required to take steps then to continue to protect that person. That's the circumstances that I can see that happening. If you look at the stats though, we have 6,000 of those cases a year. So that's why I'm saying it has to be an exceptional tool used in exceptional circumstances. Otherwise we do not have, so we have the ability, we can certainly train officers, but that takes significant investment and we need the resources to do it. And in relation to ongoing calls, we'll have officers dealing with that and still have another 160 incidents per day to respond to appropriately.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the demands on every organisation's time. I wonder specifically, Chief Superintendent, if you could comment about, because the example you gave there sort of inferred it was a third party that was delivering this information to the police, and following initial response, the police are, correct me if I'm wrong, I still would like to understand the situation where police officers arrive at a scene and the parties make counter accusations, or you're in receipt of 2 accusations, and how this legislation would impact on that, if at all, please.
So apologies then if I gave the wrong impression that was a third party. No, I'm actually talking about officers attending a live incident. So where there's a counter accusation, there is a lot of risk assessment and professional judgment comes into play. And I think that's why the new legislation is quite difficult for us, because it can be based on a single incident as opposed to a holistic view of all of the circumstances and any behaviour that's gone before. So it's very challenging for officers on the ground in terms of counter accusations. I think people talk about the wrong person being arrested. I think officers are very astute now. The awareness is much higher in terms of coercive control and who the real victim, if you like, might be in those circumstances. And I've got huge confidence now in the officers' response to that, but it still remains very challenging. And I think that's one of our concerns around the fact the legislation is much wider than the DASA.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. I'll leave it there, Convener. I have some further questions for the Chief Superintendent later about some of the police evidence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. I think Rona Mackay has a supplementary in this area, so I'm going to bring Rona Mackay in now, and then after Rona, it'll be Liam Kerr, please. Rona.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, just very briefly, it's just to ask DCS McCluskey on the line of question that John Finney made there. Just in a practical sense, if an officer determined that there was a need to apply for a DAPN, how long does that take? You know, if you know, from the point of deciding yes, this must happen, how long does it take? Do you know how long it would take to go through?
So I think that's very difficult to articulate at the moment, because we don't have this civil process that supports the criminal process that we're already involved in. However, what I can say is on average it takes 9 hours for an officer to deal with a domestic incident properly. So that's a significant demand on resources without bringing in the issuing of notices, etc.
Sure, that's great. Thank you. It was just to get an idea of that. Thanks very much. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much, Rona. Liam Kerr to pick up the questioning from here. Then after Liam, it will be Fulton McGregor, please. Liam.
Thank you, Convener. Staying on this topic, which I think is quite interesting, Gillian Maudsley, we just heard that the police will have to make some pretty significant and difficult decisions in pretty fraught circumstances. Do you foresee any issues of liability for the police here in the decisions that they make if they get it wrong, if they take a particular decision and terrible things happen as a result? Is there a liability on the police here that they should be worried about?
I think it's probably the police are best to answer how they assess liability for themselves, but they are a public sector organisation who are liable to the criminal law and prosecutions as any other organisation is, and they also have the full implications of aspects such as Osmond's warning. So having flagged up these kind of two heads, I think probably the Chief Superintendent is better placed to evaluate the liability that might attract to Police Scotland where they don't act. And certainly, I mean, they are currently in a situation on frequent occasions where they have both parties and they have to make decisions. So as the Chief Superintendent has reflected, this is a common enough circumstance.
Very grateful, and I will throw that to Detective Chief Superintendent McCluskey, please. I mean, earlier on, you said that the Police Scotland will be liable for how legislation is applied. Do you have a concern in this area? Do you have a concern about what could happen on the ground?
Yes, I think we are accountable to the legislation, and we have legitimate concerns that obviously the bill allows for, or the legislation allows for, discretion on the part of police officers. I think it's about managing expectations of other organisations of when we might apply the notices, issue the notices and apply for orders. And I do think there's legitimate concerns within Police Scotland that if we take what might be perceived to be the wrong action or inaction, if somebody perceives that we should have taken a step that we didn't, then we may find ourselves liable. But that's something that I think that's something that we still need to work out. But there are legitimate concerns around that, yes.
And following up on that, is there anything that we can be doing as a committee or within the legislation that might go some way to addressing that, or is that a practical issue once this is brought in?
I think that if we apply a lot more scrutiny and we get more clarification to the threshold, and we're very, very clear about the circumstances in which we would apply it, that builds a bit of confidence not only in the police officers who will be expected to do this, but also in the public and their confidence in their response, and that we will be lawful, that we will be proportionate, it will only be based on immediacy, urgency, necessity, etc. So I think I would like to see clarity in the legislation itself, and perhaps consideration given to taking time to see the learning from England and Wales, who have obviously repealed the previous process because of issues that have been encountered, and are implementing new legislation there.
Very grateful. Final question from me then to Professor Burton, just on exactly that point. You heard the Detective Chief Superintendent there. So how have police forces in England and Wales addressed this issue and indeed the issue of training for both officers and staff?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there were problems with the original notices, which potentially could be encountered with emergency barring orders in Scotland as well, particularly around the duration of the orders and the fact that the police had very little time and there was bureaucracy surrounding the making of the notices. And that's perhaps why there's going to be major reform to the process in England and Wales, although obviously the new orders under the new legislation are not emergency barring orders in the sense that the ones proposed in Scotland are. They are longer term orders which are intended to be the go-to order in domestic abuse cases. So we're not comparing like with like, but training obviously is a very key issue for the police. And I think that in Scotland you have had a very good training programme in place since the 2018 Act, which takes in coercive control and a broader understanding of domestic abuse. And that will be crucial to roll out that and update that training to align with the process and procedural issues with protection notices. And just a point on the liability issue, I think that the Detective Inspector was correct in saying that there are potential liabilities arising from non-action. So by taking the step to introduce into legislation emergency barring orders, Scottish Government is fulfilling its obligations under international human rights law and the Istanbul Convention. Likewise, the way that the police enforce or don't enforce protection notices will be reflected in their potential liability under human rights legislation, because victims of domestic abuse, both adult victims and children, have rights under Article 2 and Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights, the right to life and the right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment. So I think it's a very positive step in terms of meeting the obligations that the Scottish Government has under human rights law, and that the police have under human rights law, to have appropriate levels and protective orders in place for victims of domestic abuse.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Burton, and it's very good to have you back with us. So I'm sorry that we lost your connection there for a while. If there are questions that you missed but you want to contribute to, do please feel free to follow up in writing after today. But I'm sorry that the connections don't seem to be as strong today as they often are. Can I just see if Joan Tranand is back with us, or if we have lost her for the duration? Joan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now as well. Excellent. Thank you. I'm afraid we don't have time to go back over all of the ground that we've already covered this morning, but we will seek to include you with the questioning from here. And to pick up the questioning next is Fulton McGregor, please. And after Fulton, it'll be back to John Finney. Fulton.
Thanks, convener, and good morning, panel. I want to follow up on the questioning from Liam Kerr there, and also the questioning that I had to the previous panel, and that's about referring the person at risk to support organisations. Last week when we were discussing this with the Bill team, we talked about whether there should be a presumption to refer a person to support services, and whether this would be a worthy addition to the Bill, and that would obviously then require the police to explain when they've not made a referral for an individual case. So I suppose firstly coming to Detective Chief Superintendent Samantha McCluskey, do you think this would be a good move for the Bill? Do you feel that these sort of referrals are happening routinely at present, or do you think this is something that would be good on the face of the Bill?
So every time a police officer attends a domestic incident, whether it's criminal or non-criminal, they will document concerns on risk and vulnerability, and that information is shared with statutory and non-statutory partners. We, in June, at the height of the pandemic, we moved to the public task model, and I think the issue there is where we seek views rather than consent, because if consent is not obtained, it limits the opportunity for that broader risk assessment and support and intervention. So we already share information with partners in quick time where the officers have attended a domestic incident.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that. What about the other panel members? If I could move specifically to Gillian Maudsley and to Professor Burton, what do you think of the policy merits of creating such a presumption? Do you feel there's anything worthwhile in that?
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. I think that obtaining the best of information available is replicating the situation that you would have in court. And after all, one of these things that these orders are doing is creating an opportunity to plug the gap that's been described. So therefore, in normal things like child welfare, the sheriff would be looking at this balance of information and advice on both sides. So I think in any way that can be replicated, because of the significant nature of the notice and orders that are being allowed for, I think that would be the best place, and we would fully support however that is to be achieved amongst the multi-agencies that are involved.
I think referral to support is a crucial aspect of the success of emergency barring orders. If we look at the research evidence from multiple jurisdictions, it's very clear that those that have the greatest success are those where there is a wraparound provision and there's referral to support. So in that sense, a presumption of referral to support could be helpful. It's not included in the English legislation as it stands, but I think it could be regarded as a model of best practice from other jurisdictions. But I do think that if there is going to be that, then there needs to be proper resourcing of the services to back up that referral. So it's no point saying that the victims should have access to that support if it's not funded properly. So yes, I do think it's helpful to have a presumption. Victims should be able to opt out, though. It is important that it's consensual in order to be beneficial. Services shouldn't be forced upon victims of domestic abuse. It should be something that they can choose to opt out of if that's something that they're not finding helpful in their long-term safety planning.
Thanks for that. Before I come to Joan, Convener, I'm minded to refer members to my own register of interest as a registered social worker, and I apologise to yourself. I am given the nature of these panels, I should have done that initially, but hopefully you'll accept that that's done now. Joan, just to ask yourself the same question. I see actually from the chat that you're wanting in anyway. If you can ask about the presumption, what you think the merits of that might be. But also, I wonder if you could pick up on Tam Bailey's point from the previous panel, if you heard it. I'm not sure if you did, but basically he was saying, as well as a presumption to support people who are at risk, there maybe perhaps needs to be something that he was looking at, maybe automatically to support the perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators. And in that conversation, we specifically referred to the change in the Caledonia programme, which I know have had good success. I wonder, as well as talking about the presumption of those at risk, if you could comment on that as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I would fully endorse, the approach that this has to be multi-agency. We cannot solve domestic abuse on its own, and whilst I accept that police will be the first people to arrive at the house, certainly, from my own perspective, multi-agency sharing of information will support families, the victim, as well as the children, etc., going forward. In relation to perpetrators, whilst we've got the Caledonian project, etc., we also have Safe and Together approach, which is being rolled out across many local authorities, and that looks at the perpetrators' behaviour, and it looks at changing, what the capacity to change, because ultimately, once we take this order, we need to look at future planning, and I think multi-agency is a key requirement in taking this bill forward. Not one agency on their own will be able to implement change if we're going to look at children and families living in a safe.
Thanks very much for that. Convener, I see the Detective Chief Superintendent McCluskey's went back in, but obviously that's up to you, Andy, because that's me finished my question.
Yeah, TCS McCluskey, please go ahead.
Yes, it was just to add that I think our information suggests that the police are actually the most common referrers to support agencies, and that's based on our recognition that we absolutely, as a single agency, can't resolve the really complex issues around safety, etc., for women and children primarily who are victims of in this set of circumstances, and also with reference to the referral pathways for perpetrators, bearing in mind that some of these people we won't have sufficient evidence to establish that there's been a crime or report it. Rather, the Caledonian project isn't national yet, so I think there's a real lack of resources there. So the bold question would be, who would we refer them to? And that would be welcome if there was resources there, but there aren't, not nationally.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Fulton, are you done, or you got more?
No, that's me, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Fulton. In that case, John Finney will pick up the questioning from here, and then after John, it will be Annabel Ewing, please. John.
Thank you, Convener. A number of questions, please, if I may, to Detective Chief Superintendent McCluskey. And your written evidence has been particularly helpful, Detective Chief Superintendent. Now, I want to ask about how you envisage things will work in practice again, please. The decision whether to issue a notice must be taken by a police officer, inspector or above, and I think it's fair to assume that it's perhaps unlikely that it's an inspector who's necessarily going to attend at the locus of any alleged offence. So how do you see this working in practice? And I know in your evidence you've alluded to powers, or indeed an absence of, to require the perpetrator to remain with you whilst the process is completed. So are you able to say how you believe the process might work, please?
To be perfectly honest, this is another one of our concerns, the way we think there's a real lack of clarity and direction for us. you're right, it would very rarely be an inspector who would be on the ground at a domestic incident, and what's expected then is that the officers themselves conduct a risk assessment based on what they're faced with, perhaps take the individual into custody to facilitate an investigation, and again, where there's no evidence that would allow them to charge, to then approach an inspector and convince the inspector. And again, so the thresholds are different because one's criminal, so they have reasonable grounds to suspect, to bring the person into custody, to facilitate that investigation, and then convince the inspector that there are reasonable grounds to believe. And I think we might have some challenges there and need to really invest in training to get people to understand the two thresholds. But as I understand it, the legislation makes the inspector hold that belief rather than the officers, so they're going to have to convince that person.
And you alluded to in your earlier answers about the issue of risk, and risk is something that's often assessed in conjunction with other parties. You understand the information that the inspector would act upon would be from the officers who attended the scene only, or would there be engagement with other bodies?
So, given the very restrictive timescales that apply for the issuing of a notice, the inspector would have to base that decision not only on the officer's account and the evidence, if you like, that they present, but all of the other information that we hold in police systems. So, but it would be a single agency assessment. So the issuing of the notice, as we said earlier, an exceptional tool in exceptional circumstances as an emergency order. But I think that the fact that the next lawful day means it doesn't give us time to engage with our partners, which is the multi-agency approach. That's the ethos that we try to apply to assessing domestic abuse, and it just doesn't give us the opportunity to do that in preparation for applying for the order. So yes is the answer, that the inspector will be a single agency assessment for a notice.
Okay, I stress we obviously want to make good legislation and legislation that has a practical effect. And Police Scotland outlined 3 particular instances, one of them related to the no powers to require the perpetrator to remain of that process. The other one was a breach of the process, and the third one, saving time reading them all out, might be summarised as being the relationship between a notice, orders, and indeed an ongoing report to the fiscal about a matter. Can you say how you feel the legislation could be reflect your concerns and be altered? Is there specific asks that Police Scotland have, please?
Yes, I think we've engaged frequently with the legislators, and we've tried to emphasise our concerns around this. I think that we really need clarity of where these orders will sit in terms of either court-imposed orders or court-imposed restrictions like bail, special bail conditions, and other ongoing criminal processes, and indeed other, for example, family court orders. So we're not clear, and we need that clarity on how these orders are going to work together.
And thanks. Are you able to express a view whether you believe that clarity requires to be in guidance, or indeed is there something specifically on the face of the bill that would help the operation of what everyone agrees is a good intention?
I think again, the threshold, we need clarity on the threshold. We need to look at whether or not it should focus on cohabiting couples, which again would impact on child contact. And what we did see through COVID is a real increase in the number of domestic reports to us that involved child contact. So I can see there being real conflict there unless the legislation is very explicit.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a quick question, if I may, Convener, to Ms Maudsley about the issue of powers. And would you wish to comment on some of the matters I raised with the Detective Chief Superintendent, please, Ms Maudsley?
Thank you, Mr Finney. Yes, I would. I would support exactly what the Detective Chief Superintendent has said. There is enormous discretion being afforded as the bill stands to the police. And while not for 1 minute am I suggesting that the police wouldn't exercise that appropriately, we are looking at someone being deprived of their home because of circumstances that have arisen. And we've talked about proportionality, we've talked about human rights and all these other aspects. And it is that threshold that is causing an issue, because we would then question well. What about the circumstance where it's a neighbour that phones it in saying they've heard violent shouting? Is that going to be a sufficient ground that the circumstance would be applied? Now, I would not expect the Detective Chief Superintendent to be able to answer that, because she will quite rightly say depends on the facts and circumstances. But we've already addressed the fact that this could be one incident, and while with the greatest of respect to the police, I would tend to feel that they would exercise in favour of a notice, particularly when it's a short-term immediacy situation, rather than have the risk that obviously a much more significant circumstance would arise. And it's hard not to defend that. So I think the threshold is a real issue. It's got to be looked at exactly what kind of evidence, and perhaps it's not so much its primary, although I think primary would require some modification. I think the guidance as to illustrate how it is intended to work, what kind of sufficiency of evidence would trigger a notice and therefore deprive this person from their home, albeit it may be on a 24-hour 48, but I'm looking at the situation, it could be up to 4 days when we have court holidays and things like that, if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, John. Annabel Ewing, I think, is going to pick up the questioning from here, and then after Annabel, it will be Rona Mackay. Annabel.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to our panel. My first question relates to the one element of the scope of the bill, and that concerns the age threshold. So that means that it would apply to perpetrators 18 or over, whereas it would apply to victims 16 or over. And I just wonder what views may be on that. And perhaps I could start with Gillian Maudsley. And could I just say before I go to Gillian that I should remind everybody that I'm a member of the Law Society of Scotland, hold a current practicing certificate, albeit that I'm not currently practicing. Gillian.
You've illustrated, Mrs. Ewing, always the problem with these age limits, which obviously come in and work different ways. I don't think we have a set idea. We recognise the reasoning that's been put before it, so we don't have an idea to say that it's wrong or it's right, but there's obviously difficulties when you have a threshold of 16 or 18, and I think we would be happy to go along with the way the legislation goes. We don't have a problem with it, but we can recognise that others might be putting forward different views, and we obviously would be prepared to accommodate that.
Thank you for that. Could I ask if we have Joan Trinent back with us? Could we go to Joan Trinent, please?
Yep, I can hear you. Yeah, I mean, obviously, people have highlighted this morning anyway in relation to Scots Law, you know, about 16 and 18. I mean, the Children's Scotland Act 2014 clearly states that, you know, if you're at school, then attending school, then you're an adult you're a child until the age of 18. So I do think that there are some issues in relation to the differences of ages, which, you know, I just think we need to highlight here. I'm not so sure that I'm legally competent enough to advise what the outcome should be, but I just think that, you know, we need clarity, and this particular police accessory will need clarity in relation to who, you know, what is the age group for a victim and a perpetrator going forward.
Thank you for that. And I can ask vis-a-vis this question, Professor Burton, to comment on the position south of the border on this issue of age thresholds. Professor Burton, please.
Yeah, thank you. The age threshold in England and Wales, as I know it, understand it, is 18. But I can understand the reason for having the lower threshold for the party B, the victim, in this instance. It may be that you have got young people in a relationship living independently at a lower age. Therefore, I don't see any difficulty with lowering the threshold for the victim to the age of 16.
Okay, thank you for that. And my other question concerns the issue of the consent of the victim vis-a-vis the notice, the DAPN, and indeed the order, the DAPO. And I wonder if I could start with DCS McCluskey. to see what the view is of Police Scotland on the matter, because in the bill that's currently drafted, there's not a requirement to obtain the consent of the victim to either protective order. And also, whilst I think it is anticipated that there would be nothing to stop consent being sought, and that may be the norm, there would be, by way of exception, although this is not written directly in the bill, the possibility of seeking consent. But I just wonder if DCS McCluskey could give her thoughts on the approach as is currently proposed. Thank you.
Yep. So police officers already seek the views of the victim on every occasion that they engage with them. But as I alluded to earlier, we have adopted the public task model, where we will share information if we suspect that there's a risk there, and there is a support intervention that can be put in place to support that victim. I also think there's a very clear difference between the notice, seeking views for the notice, and the order, which is obviously court imposed, and to be honest, probably requires consent to allow us to police any breaches of the order. So there's a very clear line between the two from my point of view. But just to give that reassurance that we do seek the views on every occasion anyway. My later concern is if we have to require consent from individuals, who is that then tasked to, and is that an additional demand on the police to go away and evidence all of that for the application for the order, or an interim order, or an extension, etc.
I hear what DCS McCluskey says in that regard, and that's a fair point from an operational perspective. I wonder, and I raised this in the previous panel, just the practicalities of a DAPN, even where views have been sought, being served, and it seems it's to be served where the perpetrator resides. So potentially police is serving the DAPN on the perpetrator, who is currently in situ in the matrimonial home or the like, as a shortcut in terms of expression, and the victim is there. I mean, how do you foresee that working as a matter of practice?
I can't actually envisage a set of circumstances where we would serve a notice on an individual who was still within the family home, because to my mind that would significantly increase the risk to the victim and any children and any other person that was within that home. And I think that's where the threshold needs to be really clear, and the circumstances in which the notice should be issued needs to be really explicit, so that the notice has to be served on the individual in person. We can't do that when they're still in the home, and actually we're creating further risk there. So that's why the circumstances that we envisage using are, in exceptional circumstances where we can't charge somebody, they've been in our custody, but we know that the risk is so great that they cannot go back to the family home. And we wouldn't do that in the presence of the victim and any children.
Well, thank you for that clarification from the practical perspective. I'm not entirely sure that the bill states that expressly, but perhaps I could go to Gillian Maudsley in that regard and ask Gillian, do you feel that the bill as currently drafted supports what the DCS is saying?
I think that this issue of consent, I think that it's got to be absolutely required that the views of the victim are sought. I say that from an Article 8 perspective alone. Now, we know in criminal law, both of us obviously, that criminal prosecution can still proceed without the victim, and quite correctly, the criminal law overrides the, if you like, the personal interest. The proportionality requires that. So here, there must be a requirement of asking for consent. If consent isn't given, and it is a very difficult one, but because you can see the circumstances arriving of the problems with the children and everything else. But I would say to Parliament very clearly to consider very carefully when a notice would go ahead without the consent of the victim, because this is talking about civil rather than criminal. And I think the rights of the victim must be to the fore, however that's factored in. So I would say that I think that's a question, and I would totally support our Detective Chief Superintendent that it needs to be absolutely clear, because this is being raised, if you like, as a question now. So it's not as if it's arising after the bill's been done. So I think whatever side that comes down, I would say that the views must be sought. Whether they can be overridden in this situation is a matter, I think, very clearly for legislation, and that would then allow the clarity that we need as lawyers, and obviously the clarity that the police are saying that shouldn't be left to their discretion.
Thank you for that. And maybe I could just go finally to Professor Burton, just to see from a comparative perspective what kind of approaches within her knowledge are taken elsewhere on this specific issue. Professor Burton, please.
Yes, I mean, there are a variety of different approaches across different European jurisdictions that I've looked at. Some require consent, others don't. Obviously, it's an extremely controversial issue because we want to support, as far as possible, the autonomous decision-making of victims. We don't want to replicate the coercive control or the abuse that they've suffered at the hand of the perpetrator of the domestic abuse by imposing state control on them. So it is an extremely controversial issue. I think as far as possible that the victim's wishes should be ascertained as they are in criminal proceeding, as DCS pointed out, that we do try to take into account the victim's views, and perhaps the legislation as it's currently drafted is a little bit passive on that, in saying that the victim's views should be taken into account when they've been sought. Perhaps there needs to be a stronger requirement to actively seek the views of the victim, but I don't think that they can be or should be overriding looking at best practice in other jurisdictions, because again, it can dramatically reduce the utility of an emergency borrowing order if the victim's consent is required, because then of course it opens the victim up to pressure from the perpetrator of the abuse not to give consent. So we can't assume that in a situation of coercive control, victims are able to give their consent to orders that may well be in their best interest and the interests of the children as well. So I think that at least in terms of the notices, it's right that consent should not be a precondition. I think more careful consideration has to be given to the longer term orders, and I know that Women's Aid in their evidence, Scottish Women's Aid, have suggested that for the orders consent should be a precondition, and I agree again with DCS submission in relation to that. If you have orders without consent, practically they're unenforceable because you're relying heavily on the parties themselves, the victim, to report breaches in order for them to be enforced. So it may well be, from a practical point of view, there is not much point in having the longer term order without the consent of the victim, given that they're going to be crucial to the effective enforcement of the order.
Thank you for that, Professor, and thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Annabelle. Rona, you were next on my list to ask questions, but on this area, I don't know if there's anything left in this area that you want to come in on.
Just one very brief one to DCS McCluskey. DCS McCluskey, you said that your officers sought the views of the person in all cases. Can I just ask what happens when when that happens and the officer thinks there is a risk and the person doesn't consent? What happens then? Are the children and the woman left at risk, or can you maybe just talk through the practicalities of that?
So every case is taken on its own merits, so every set of circumstances is judged individually. Where a person's views, so not consent, but where we seek the person's views about referral or sharing information with a partner, I think the officers are quite well trained to recognise the fact that sometimes victims don't recognise the level of risk themselves that they face. And there's a professional judgment has to be made there about whether or not a meaningful intervention can take place with support organisations, because the police can't resolve all the other complex issues. So it might be the case that even where the view is sought and the person says, no, I don't want you to refer me to Women's Aid or Assist or whoever that might be in their particular area, that the officers themselves consider that there is sufficient risk that the information should be shared. And I think that's the right way to go, to be honest, to enable that in a holistic assessment of it.
Thank you for that. I mean, just to point out, the women's organisations did say that women themselves were the best predictors of risk. You know, from experience, that's what they found. But I just wanted to get your view on that, if it was a negative reaction. Okay, thank you, convener. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rhoda. Joan Trennant has indicated that she wants to come in on this. Joan.
So please do attend. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, just
Please.
to offer reassurance that obviously when police do attend a domestic abuse incident, if the victim or the mother is saying that, you know, she's not consenting to further information, if the risk is deemed significant for children, then obviously there's other routes that people, you know, that police can take, and, you know, an automatic referral into children's services would be one where, if it wasn't immediate, then obviously further assessment would be taken the next again morning. So there's always checks and balances in place, you know, if consent can't be gained that evening.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joan. I think we caught that. We have about 10 minutes left, and I have questions from Rhoda and Liam Kerr. So Rhoda, please.
Thank you, convener. As well as the person at risk, police officers have to take on the views and welfare of any associated children before making a protection notice. Could I ask DCS Sam McCluskey how would that be done in practice, and whether she is happy with the drafting of Section 4 on this point?
I think we have emphasised that we would like Section 4 to be much clearer. Officers are encouraged to seek the views of children that are within those circumstances of domestic abuse, and that's consistent with the Children's Scotland Act, that they do, where possible, seek those views. But obviously what we're talking about here is an emergency situation where they're going to have to make quick time dynamic risk assessments and judgments. And I think that's, for me, that's where the difficulty lies in terms of resources and the time that particularly takes, and the length of time that we've got between the notice and the order to actually seek views.
So what you're saying is it's maybe not possible to do that in relation to the notice?
It's not. I don't think it's going to be practically possible on every single occasion.
Okay. And can I just ask whether you believe other family members or close friends should be included in the notice? At the moment, it's just the person at risk and the children.
So I think the notice, the new legislation is very much aligned to the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act and the definition of an intimate partnership. And I think that that's correct. We do have frameworks in terms of child protection, adult support and protection, and there are other ways that we can address risk to other individuals, but this is very specific to domestic abuse and the dynamics of domestic abuse. So I think it's right that it stays that way.
I'm sorry, what I meant was if the abuser, and it is domestic abuse, being taken out of the situation, then maybe resorts to turning their attention to family members or close friends in order to continue to perpetrate that abuse through a third party.
So that should then be investigated as a domestic abuse incident or a crime under the legislation from 2018. So it's absolutely recognised that a perpetrator can try to use other family members, third parties, children to perpetrate the abuse on victims. I think these notices are very much about excluding them from the family home and keeping the family safe within that home environment in the short term.
Okay, thank you. And could I ask Professor Mandy Burton how how the bill compares with the UK bill on the points about taking on the views of children?
I think you're probably going much further in terms of taking on the views of children. I can see that that's aligned with the legislation that you've put in place in terms of taking into account children's views. Obviously, when it comes to taking into account children's views, regard has to be given to their age and maturity. And I'd just like to sort of reinforce the points that again made by DCS McCluskey in relation to the time pressures for taking children's views, particularly in relation to the notices. I'm afraid that I probably dropped out when the question of the duration of the orders were being considered. I do think that the very short time period for the notices makes it impossible to gather all the information and evidence that would be needed, and to take children's views fully into account. And this question of taking into account children's views is probably more relevant to the longer court orders rather than the notices. And a point that was made about the level of authorisation as well, being the inspector, that builds in some delay. As was said, the inspector doesn't attend the scene. It's not going to be the inspector that's talking to the children, and more junior officers may be reluctant to undertake this type of task and pass that information back up to more senior officers. Certainly looking at what happened in England and Wales was that was a significant barrier to notices being made, the fact that a more senior officer had to be approached for the authorisation. So I do think there are significant practical problems in taking into account children's views in the making of a notice. But I agree that the approach that the Scottish Government is proposing for taking into account children's views for the longer court orders is very helpful, and the legislation goes a good way into establishing what the appropriate weighting should be given towards children's views in that process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Rhoda. Liam Kerr, I think, wants to ask about the question of who can apply for an order. Liam.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. It's just basically the same line that I was exploring earlier with the earlier panel, where I asked who should have power to apply for an order, because Section 8 says it's just the police. So, Joan Tranent, given that the local authorities have powers in relation to other protective orders, why is your view that they shouldn't have similar powers here?
Aye. Yeah, I mean, I listened to obviously the earlier points in relation to, you know, who else should have it, health, coming from MARAC, homeless, etc. I do think we need to be proportionate here. Police are the first attendees when an incident like this occurs. Invariably, most incidents happen after hours, and whilst we always have an emergency social work service on call, they often don't know, the families that we're talking about. So police do have a good understanding of their local communities, their families, etc. And therefore, I would, from a Social Work Scotland perspective, say that, they are best placed at this moment in time in order to take the notification out. Obviously, that doesn't mean that, following that for a longer term order, that we then think about the multi-agency approach, because it does, as I keep saying, this needs to be multi-agency going forward, not just a police-only, route, etc. But in the initial instances, I do think that police are well suited in order to attend to this and make the appropriate assessment of risk at that moment in time.
Yeah, and that's in relation to the notice. In relation to the order, I think looking at your submission, it would be your view that local authorities wouldn't have the power to apply for an order. But am I hearing now that perhaps there's some nuance in there that, or some wriggle room in there?
I think what was stated before was that this would require resources, it would require training, because obviously local authorities, in relation to taking any protection orders, for it being adult support and protection or for child protection, obviously have another route, a civil route that they can take orders in relation to this. So I suppose, yeah, we would need resources, and there would need to be obviously lots of further training in relation to local authorities undertaking this order. There would obviously have to be good communication as well, because obviously housing comes under local authority. So it would have to be very much a joined up approach. And from a Social Work Scotland perspective, I'm not able to comment on my housing colleagues at this moment in time as to whether they would see themselves in a position to advocate for this at this moment.
Thank you for that. Detective Chief Superintendent McCluskey, so you've heard that answer, and you've heard Joan Tranent talking about a joined-up approach. Now, Police Scotland, in their submission, were very concerned about the resource implications of the police being the sole responsible body. So I'll ask you to develop that. What are the concerns about the resources? But if, as I think Police Scotland would envisage, the responsibility were to be extended, how do you see the joined up approach that Joan was describing? All organisations would be working to the same considerations of need, and what would need to happen to ensure that the police got all the information about any orders granted to ensure that you can carry out your enforcement duty?
Some of our, our colleagues and other organisations have expressed concerns about resources and infrastructure. We hold the same concerns. This would require significant investment in resources, training, legal services, etc., for us to be able to implement this, bearing in mind that there are 160 domestic incidents reported to Police Scotland every day on average. I do think that the timescales are very prohibitive, so the next lawful day from a notice, I think that it's fine that the police can issue a notice. The fact that we have only until the next lawful day to apply for a court order is very restrictive for us to be able to engage meaningfully with our partners and have a multi-agency meeting, if you like. If that was extended to 7 days, then the opportunity arises for us to have that multi-agency approach and gather in all the relevant information. I don't think that we should restrict this solely to the police. I think that with the right investment and the right resources, other organisations who have experience of applying for civil orders should be able to do so.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener.
Sorry, thank you very much. I don't think any other member has any questions that they'd like to ask, but can I just return to the issue of the duration of both a notice and an order under this bill? A number of you have expressed some concerns and reservations about that issue, but I just wonder if we needed to bring that all together. So by way of, as it were, sort of closing remarks, if Gillian first had any comments about the duration of either a domestic abuse protection notice or the order, if she could draw those comments to the committee's attention, that would be helpful. And I'll ask each of our witnesses that question. Gillian first, please.
With regard to the notice, I think as long as it's accepted that it could extend to a 4-day period in the circumstances when there's court holidays, then as long as it's restricted to absolute immediacy and short term, so notice provision. With regard to the order, I think our feeling was that 3 months is a very long period, potentially. It's obviously 2 months and then a further extension. It doesn't seem clear in the bill as to the grounds for the extension or what would be required by way of the extension. And I would just remind the committee that there are a plethora of other civil and criminal orders that we've referred to which are interacting on the horizon. And I would have thought that 3 months was a very long period when there are other measures that might have been put in place. I mean, we are aware of interim interdicts. Now, I appreciate that there might be an urgency and you can't get them, but within that longer period, some of these other measures may be obtainable, and therefore there's not a need for this to exist for such a period of time, and certainly beyond the 2-month period. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask the same question to DCS McCluskey, please?
The time limits on the existing notices are probably what they raise most for us are significant practical concerns. It is very challenging for us in terms of demand on resources, and also it doesn't allow for that multi-agency approach. In terms of the length of time that the orders might apply for, I understand what Gillian's saying around short timescales, and it's not just victims' rights that need to be considered, albeit safety always would take primacy. But in our experience, it can take a lot of time to build confidence in a victim and actually to resolve all the complex issues around housing, etc. And I'm not entirely convinced that 2 months is a lengthy enough period to allow for meaningful intervention to actually be as effective as it could be.
Okay, thank you. Joan Trunnan, do you have any views about the duration of either a notice or an order under the bill?
Yeah, I mean, one day is very short time, and I think a 4-day period would be, better in relation to getting a fuller assessment if required. I think, like the police, the 3 months, things do not move quickly in housing or social work or anything else. And more importantly, this could be a family that very few agencies know. So in order to get to know people, build up that trust, etc., going forward, I think, even 3 months is a very short period in time. So, yeah, that would be Social Work Scotland view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Professor Burton, you've already alluded to this, so please don't feel the need to repeat yourself. But is there anything you'd like to add in addition to what you've already said about time limits with regard to these notices and orders?
Yes, thank you. I think both are too short. 48 hours is too short, and it's going to, as the police evidence has been submitted, create huge practical problems. A period of 4 to 7 days would be much more helpful, and the evaluative research on domestic violence prevention notices in England and Wales indicated that the short duration of the notices created huge problems and potentially led to a problem of significant underutilisation. So we've heard evidence that there's a danger that the orders will be overused. In reality, the empirical research shows the opposite, that there's a big danger of underutilisation of the orders. And one of the factors that contributed to that, at least in England and Wales, was the short duration of the notices and the practical problems that the police then encountered in applying for the longer term orders. And I'd just like to agree with the other submissions in terms of the domestic abuse prevention order, in that 2 months is a relatively short time. To take up Gillian's point that other orders are available, for example, interim interdicts, that doesn't really cover the fact that those remedies have to be sought by the victim themselves through their own financial resources or potentially through legal aid if that's available, whereas these orders do not put those financial and administrative burden upon the victim. And if we're looking at Article 52 of the Istanbul Convention, it's very clear that these emergency borrowing orders should be available to victims without financial or other burden, and therefore I think some more consideration could be given to the duration to give the practical opportunity for long-term safety planning to be put in place.
That's very clear. Thank you very much, Professor Burton. I see Gillian Maudsley wants to respond to that. So last word to Gillian Maudsley, please.
Very much, Convener. Very briefly, I would be very, very concerned at any extension of the notice period. This is an immediacy and it is powers being exercised by the police. It needs to be before a judicial authority at the earliest opportunity. That seems to be the whole proportionality and at the absolute substance of the bill. So I just wanted to stress I can understand the practical resourcing implications, but this is emergency and should only be emergency because of the circumstances and entirely appropriate for it to be before the first court day. And I would be very resistant to any extension beyond that period. But thank you very much for the opportunity to come back.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much, Gillian Maudsley, DCS McCluskey, Joan Tranent, and Professor Mandy Burton. Thank you very much for your evidence this morning. I'm very sorry that we had some technical issues and we lost one or two of you for a short period of time. But please do feel free to come back to the committee, any of you, with any supplementary evidence that you might care to give. We'll be putting a number of the issues that you have raised with us today to the Scottish Government, to the Cabinet Secretary, when he appears before us on the 12th of January. And you've been very helpful with your time and expertise today. Thank you all very much. And as before, we'll just suspend now for 5 minutes to enable a changeover of witnesses. So we will reconvene at 12:16. Thank you. Welcome back and welcome to our third and final panel of witnesses this morning. And we're joined now by Paul Short, who's the Homelessness Manager at Fife Council, by Callum Chomtuk, Director of the Chartered Institute of Housing, Gary Burns from Homeless Action Scotland, and Stacey Dingwall, Senior Policy Manager at the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. And I'm going to ask Shona Robertson to start the questions to this panel. Shona, please.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, panel. I want to just start with the written submission to the committee from the Chartered Institute of Housing, which said that it thought that the power to apply for a DAPO should be extended to social landlords. So I'd like to start by asking Callum to elaborate on this and to ask whether other panel members agree. For the sake of time, could you also cover whether you're concerned that this could potentially undermine the policy advantages of clarity and consistency, which the government says are associated with just giving the police this power? If you could wrap those into your answer for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Committee, for having us, and happy to comment on those questions. Yeah, and we asked our members across the housing profession, but principally social landlords, and they were keen that this power was extended to social landlords. Social landlords have got a huge amount of experience in actually making representations to the courts on behalf of tenants, bringing forward kind of eviction processes and encouraging kind of removal of people committing actions such as antisocial behaviour. I think importantly, because these are civil orders as well, actually having a social landlord act can be an important place for a victim of domestic abuse to come to. Many victims of domestic abuse will feel uncomfortable about raising issues with the police. The association of criminality within that, civil orders are different, and given the skills and experience that social landlords have and their willingness to actually take on this power, we think that would be an appropriate mechanism. I recognise the kind of the comments around having to make the system overly complex, but I think the focus of the bill is to try and extend these provisions and make them as useful as possible. And I think having trained individuals, including housing professionals, able to take forward DAPOs would be an appropriate extension of the bill as it stands.
Before I move on to the other panel members, Callum, can you see any issues with some of the small social landlords, whether they would have the capacity to perhaps, be able to take forward these orders? Do you think that might be an issue for some of the small social landlords?
Well, I think as part of this bill, there'll be statutory guidance that's developed along with training. I think previous witnesses have talked about that, and that's massively important. We also know, however, can you raise a relevant point, that actually social landlords across the whole, there are exceptions, but don't have massively developed domestic abuse policies and protocols in place. I'm hopeful that the process of passing this legislation will encourage more landlords to actually develop better policies and protocols. But ultimately, this is a responsibility landlords have. They take cases to courts regarding antisocial behaviour and other eviction processes. Actually, looking after the welfare of their tenants is a core component. There may be examples where it is more appropriate that the police would take that up to the courts. However, I think having that ability for landlords, so where victims feel concerned about engaging through what might be a perception of a criminal process, actually having a social landlord may be a more effective way to raise this concern with the courts.
Okay, just to quickly turn to the other panel members then, can I turn to Stacey Dingwall first of all? Do you agree with that?
Thank you. Yes, I would support the comments made by Callum there. Certainly if the purpose of the bill is to empower both social landlords and tenants and victims of domestic abuse in a situation, that would seem a sensible approach to take. And also in the case of social landlords, I think what's really been key for us, and I hope it's reflected in our response, is the importance of the statutory guidance for our members in order to be able to bring forward these powers and support them to put in place policies.
Okay, can I get the view of Gary Burns?
Yeah, thank you. Hi. We would fundamentally disagree with the power being extended to housing officers. The reason for that is that the DAPN can effectively end up resulting in a criminal charge for the accused perpetrator. We feel that the housing officer is going to be the person who's going to end up issuing a decree for eviction, and for them to be involved at the very start of the investigatory period creates a conflict of interest. As we've already seen, I've been watching since this morning, the police have problems with issuing DAPNs, so to think that you can take this kind of criminal or civil matter then issued to housing officers who may or may not have had previous issues with the tenant. Believe that creates a conflict of interest that makes it possible for them to be judge, jury and executioner in terms of assessing whether somebody should or should not be evicted from their own home.
Okay, that's very interesting and helpful. I'll come back to Callum to get a response to that in a second, but could I hear from Paul Short firstly?
Yes, good afternoon. We would support the position of the Chartered relation to landlords being able to take actions. And the primary reason around that is because quite often people experiencing domestic abuse, well, the first point of contact will be their landlord, and the issue raised by Callum around the reluctance of some experiencing domestic abuse to go into what they say is a criminal sphere in terms of their situation is to approach. The other thing I would say is that very often landlords are part of a larger, wider multi-agency approach, and particularly in local authorities, there's a long history of that. We have worked in the MARAC sphere for quite a long time as well. So there is the background there as well that the committee can perhaps take comfort that quite often this will come from a place multi-agency working.
Oh, okay, thank you. That wasn't very easy to hear some of Paul's comments there, but maybe that's something that can be picked up by our tech people. Can I just come back to Callum briefly to just get a very quick response to what Gary Burns was saying about the potential conflict of interest? How would you respond to that, Callum?
I think housing professionals are entirely that. They're professional. You'll have landlords are used to it. It's a common practice for landlords to take things to court and provide a kind of evidence base in order to have a court take action. I think that was set out clearly for the courts. And I think the overriding objective for me of this piece of legislation is to give rights to victims of abuse, to ensure that their voice is heard, and providing that greater opportunity, different access points for them, I think is at the heart of this bill. And I think giving that ability that social landlords and housing practitioners can raise this will provide confidence to victims who are just reticent to utilise police. I would just be concerned that if we only have one route into raising a domestic abuse protection order, it may limit the kind of potential benefits that we might see. And I hear what Gary's saying. I disagree with the kind of risk. I think there's greater risks about not having kind of multiple routes to kind of access the court and ultimately putting victims' voice at the heart of it.
Oh, okay. I see Gary wants to come back in, but I'll maybe ask Gary if he could give his remarks at the start of answer to the next question, just for the sake of time, if that's okay. Just on the duration, maximum duration of a DAPO is 3 months, so that's what's proposed anyway. And the written submission, again, the Chartered Institute of Housing suggested this might be too short, where a social landlord is trying to evict a tenant under Section 18 of the bill. And there might be advantages to greater flexibility around the maximum duration of a DAPO in these circumstances. So, first of all, I just want to ask whether panel members agree with this, and if so, how long would be necessary, and should the maximum be set by legislation or by the court? And should the court have to review the continuation of a DAPO in an individual case to ensure that the measure lasts no longer than necessary? I'm going to come to Gary first, given that he wanted to come back in previously.
Okay, thank you. Just on the last point, what I would say is that if housing officers or senior housing officers have significant evidence which demonstrates that there's domestic abuse happening within the household, then provide that to the police and allow the police to then investigate and pick that matter up. There's no necessity to give housing officers the ability to stop somebody from accommodating their own home. We believe very strongly that that should sit with the police. On your point about the timescales, I think that there is some issues around the timescales. Your question was, should it be set by Parliament or by the court? I would suggest that given that courts can give some recourse to proportionality, that it would sit with the court about how long something should lead. That maybe the legislation should suggest that there's a limited time, but the courts should have maybe some discretion, because in order for the housing associations or the councils to start the eviction proceedings, that can sometimes take some time because of the way that the courts work. So perhaps some discretion should be given to the courts in order to either extend or shorten the length of time through which the DPO is applied, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, it does. Can I come to Stacey Dingwall with the same question about duration, please?
Yes, I think there are potentially some issues around it. 3 months it can obviously go very quickly. In terms of who should have the discretion, I would agree that there could be some provision within the legislation, but the court should retain that element of discretion in those cases.
Okay, and Paul Short?
Yes, hopefully people can hear me a bit better. I would agree that the time period that's laid out is very tight, and that for landlords it could end up being quite a rush. So I would suggest that yes, it should be extended in that line with the courts.
Okay, I think we just about got that. And finally, Callum, just given it was from your evidence, did you want to just add anything to what's been said?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think the bill as it stands is kind of composed of two parts around the kind of introduction of DPANs and DPOs. And I think that's incredibly complementary to the provisions around social landlords being able to end joint tenancies. I think we could get into a situation where we are applying an order, but then allowing someone to return to a domestic setting while a condition where social landlords are still trying to go for a formal process of a kind of a permanent eviction. I think that creates a confusion in the legislation. I think until we're able to ensure there's a settled process, a settled outcome for the victim and the perpetrator's accommodation, it seems appropriate that there should be some flexibility in actually how long an order should last for. I don't think we can prescribe that in the length of the bill. I think that if we had a more streamlined court process, we could get to a conclusion better. So I think it's difficult to prescribe that. I think we want to see kind of flexibility and interpretations from the court.
Should the court have to review the continuation of the DAPO in an individual case, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely right. I think, but yeah, what I'd like to see is the court bear in mind the we need to see a settled housing outcome. I think it's in no one's interest to see a potential perpetrator return to the domestic setting while a social landlord is halfway through or 3/4 of the way through a process of eviction. It would undermine the whole intent of the bill. So until we have a settled outcome, I think it'd be inappropriate to have an order come to a conclusion.
Okay, thank you. That's all from me, convener.
Thank you very much, Shona. I think Rhoda Grant's going to pick up the questioning from here, and then after Rhoda, it will be Rona Mackay. Rhoda, please.
Can I ask, in relation to Section 18, what's the key issues with the existing powers available to people at risk under the Matrimonial Homes legislation and to social landlords under the Housing Scotland Act 2001? And can you say in very general terms, because there'll be an opportunity for greater detail later, whether you think Section 18 solves the problems you've identified? And can I ask Stacey maybe to take that question?
Thank you. I think overall, what the current legislation doesn't do, and hopefully the new legislation would do, would empower both the victim and social landlords in these cases. Domestic abuse is obviously a very complicated situation, and I think this just makes it clearer and where the appropriate power lies. I think most importantly, it removes the onus from the victim to take action if they know that the social landlord is empowered to take action. So that's why we would welcome the introduction of Section 18.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? Not seeing anybody indicate. Okay, can I...
Callum and Gary are both indicating that they'd like to come in and do Rhoda. So can we have Callum first and then Gary, please?
Thank you. So on the kind of existing laws that are in place, I think we heard from a previous panelist earlier, but between the Matrimonial Homes Act, it has criteria around eligibility for you need to pay for it yourself and address kind of access legal aid and accessing legal aid and paying for it. So there's a barrier there. Also around the kind of the existing 2001 Housing Act, we also require them to often be victim led, and it could be an experience that they have to give evidence in court. None of these are ideal circumstances when you're going through a fairly difficult process of trying to end the joint tenancy. Given the limitations in the law as it stands, we feel that the provisions that are set out in the draft bill would be appropriate, and they would allow, as Stacey said, it would give the victims the confidence that a landlord can kind of progress this on their behalf, and they're not forced to go through any kind of assessment of criteria or put themselves in the unenviable position of actually going into court and making representations themselves.
Thank you. And Gary, do you want to come in on this issue as well?
Yeah, we'd like to come in and say that when a tenancy is terminated by the perpetrator of domestic abuse against a survivor, what we want to make sure that's enshrined in the legislation is that there's no discrimination based against the survivor. So should that person have had issues around antisocial behaviour or maybe have had rent arrears, that should not disbar them from then getting a new tenancy, because I see that the perpetrator of the domestic abuse may well be evicted, but in the legislation, in section 25 of 18, it says it's where the landlord wishes to create a new tenancy. That shouldn't really be a wish, that should be a duty to give a tenancy to the victim. Now, if there is issues around antisocial behaviour or rent arrears, then deal with that in a normal way. But if we are really wanting to support people who are going through domestic abuse, survivors of domestic abuse, then we deal with the domestic abuse side of stuff first, and then if there is any issues around rent arrears, that should not disbar that victim or survivor from getting a new tenancy. And quite a lot of local housing policies would disbar that person from getting a new tenancy. We want to ensure that this legislation makes sure that even if a victim has had issues with ASBOs, has had issues with their landlord, they are still entitled to that new tenancy, irrespective of any of their previous behaviours according to what their landlord thinks. Because at the end of the day, we're dealing with a victim of domestic abuse here. There's other issues, we deal with that after they've got a new tenancy, which gives them the rights. We'd also suggest that perhaps maybe one of the things that should be pegged on the back of this is actually, as well as evicting the perpetrator of abuse, should we not really be offering the victim or the survivor of domestic abuse a right to move? Because a lot of that abuse has happened within a certain tenancy, within a certain home. We are accepting and we are going to go ahead with evicting somebody for creating domestic abuse. Surely there's an argument then to be made that the person who's been the victim or the survivor of domestic abuse is allowed a move within that social tenancy, within that social landlord, within that local authority. And it's completely missing from the legislation. But if the argument is, and we are going to evict somebody for their domestic abuse, surely the argument also says that we should be moving the victim so that we can protect them, give them a new home, and move them away from the place where they've been tormented for years.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, I think we're moving into areas that Rona Mackay wanted to ask about anyway, so we'll come back to a number of those issues in a second. I know Callum wants to come in, but Callum, just be patient if you would, and we'll certainly come back to those. But can I just ask Rhoda first if she is finished with her questions or she has anything further?
Can I just ask another question, please? In relation to Section 18, a court must make an order where various conditions associated with the use of the new grounds are met, and either it is reasonable to make an order, or the perpetrator has been convicted of an offence in the last 12 months, punishable by imprisonment relating to his or her abusive behaviour. Are you happy with the new threshold in the new test, and are you clear about what evidence will be required in court and from whom? I don't know who wants to come in on that one.
I'm quite happy to answer that.
Go ahead, please, Gary.
I think the threshold has to be that there has been some conviction either at a civil court or a criminal court for domestic abuse. I think that's your threshold. There's evidence-based, in a police investigation, that has to be your minimum threshold. Because, as previously mentioned by different panel members, complexities around domestic abuse are difficult to ascertain, but at the very least, at the very minimum, we should be looking at kind of court orders where there's been civil or criminal convictions for some form of domestic abuse, and there's a whole plethora of where that sits.
I see Callum's wanting to come in as well on that. I wonder if that's appropriate under the notices and orders, or whether that would be something.
Yeah, I would disagree with that. I would disagree with Gary. I think that that's too high a threshold to enact this kind of legislation. I think that housing officers, housing managers, social landlords are, as well as kind of social work and other professionals, are kind of well experienced and well evidenced about actually kind of understanding when domestic abuse is in a setting. Quite frankly, the person who knows best is the victim. And it's the victim that will often come forward to a kind of social landlord and express their concern that they are the victim of domestic abuse and they're needing that support. I think creating an artificial barrier, what I'd see as a criminal conviction, is going to completely deter people from engaging in the process, and for me undermine the point about supporting victims. And I'd likely just quickly pick up on what Gary said around moving the victim to look after them. I think that is ultimately that tends to be the process we have right now among social landlords. Most people tend to move the victim and their family, and maybe time and time again. And what we're finding is that we're punishing the victim by moving them in the time and time again, because we're finding perpetrators don't want to move, because it's ultimately easier for social landlords. If I know there's a great piece of work done in Fife that explored this, called Change, Justice, Fairness, and Paul might, if his connections might be able to speak to that. They explored the experience of victims who've been moved by a system that was supposed to help them. So I'd be reticent about making an assumption that we want to move victims. I think we want to listen to victims, and for the most part, they know what's best for them. In the majority of cases, they'd like to stay in their own domestic setting. And this legislation, I think, as drafted, will help give them that choice to stay in that home.
Okay, thank you very much. I know that Gary and Paul want to come in, but Rona wants to pick up questioning in this area anyway, so I'm going to invite them to wrap their what they want to say into their responses to Rona's question. So Rona, over to you, please.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, a key feature of Section 18 is the obligation of social landlords to provide advice and assistance to perpetrators regarding the availability of alternative accommodation. Can I ask you then what issues you think this raises for perpetrators, for people at risk, local authorities and registered social landlords? And, you know, we've obviously just been discussing support for victims as well. But can I go to Paul Short first, please, and then Callum, Gary and Stacey?
Hi, so I'm hoping my connection's better and people can hear me a little bit better. I just wanted to pick up on one of the earlier points raised about victims. Within Fife, we have had a project running for some time, working with people who've experienced domestic abuse. And the kind of key issue that people tell us is the ability to have the choice to either remain in the home that they love in a lot of cases, or where appropriate to get a move. So I think it's entirely appropriate to allow people experiencing domestic abuse to have. On the point of perpetrators, I think it's entirely appropriate to work with perpetrators as well. Within Fife, we're very lucky to have the Caledonia project, where we can work with our colleagues in other agencies to refer perpetrators on to get assistance. But one of the key issues is coming up with housing for perpetrators to move them on, and the ability as well for housing officers to be able to have that discussion with perpetrators is important as well. So I think, yeah, we need to be very careful about issues around perpetrators, but we should be able to move on where appropriate.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Callum, would you like to comment?
So I think the rehousing of perpetrators is absolutely central to the legislation to be effective. We don't want any situation where perpetrators are feeling they are being overtly punished and there's any consequences on the victim. And indeed, actually, the victim perhaps knowing where the perpetrator is living can be actually a real source of comfort. There's already existing duties on local authorities regarding homelessness. I think the legislation is drafted about calling for advice and assistance. I think it, to me, isn't ambitious enough. I think it could be a lot less in practice, and I don't necessarily think it needs to be set out in the legislation, but I think in the guidance will have to be, I think, quite prescriptive around some of the protocols we'd like to see developed between RSLs and local authorities to ensure that there is the rehousing of perpetrators. We absolutely recognise there's some very, very small social landlords across Scotland. Supply is an issue, exactly as Paul has said, so there might ultimately be they do not have stock available. So where we can facilitate management transfer to another housing association or another or a local authority, that'd be appropriate. Leslie, I think the kind of advice and assistance it could be interpreted to be quite a low-level intervention, and I'd be concerned that may lead to the perpetrator not being rehoused successfully.
Okay, thank you. Gary?
Hi, yeah, well, the existing legislation is as if a person given some kind of interdict to not present their normal family home, they can present as homeless. So I don't see there being any legislation. The police turn up and issue their order to say that they can't be there for the next 2 or 3 weeks. Then that person can either find their own accommodation or present to the local authority as homeless. The legislation states quite clearly that they can't really.
Okay. So just to be clear, yeah. So Gary, you don't think perpetrators should be given advice and support per se? They go through the normal channels.
I'm not saying that they should be given advice or support. What I'm saying is that in the immediacy, so say the police turn up on a Friday night at 6 o'clock and there's been a domestic abuse incident, police say you need to remove yourself, we're going to issue with this PN order. And they say, well, I've got nowhere to go. Well, the police just need to say to them, turn up to your local council. Because the test for most homelessness is that they've got nowhere reasonably they can find. If they turn up and say that they can't go back to the home because they've been charged with a domestic abuse incident, then if they present to a local authority, the local authority must give them a temporary accommodation. So I don't see needing to be any change in legislation in this aspect to give the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator additional protections. It doesn't mean they can't go back to their housing association and say, I think you can move me to a different place. I mean, the realities of that happening are almost zero, but like they still have the right to homeless accommodation. They've made themselves homeless by virtue of being charged with domestic abuse.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Stacey.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd just like to reiterate earlier comments and just overall, I think it's important not to underestimate the experience of social landlords as well as the important relationships they have with their tenants as compared to other tenures. I think it's just important to, especially this year, I think we can all appreciate that social landlords have worked very closely with tenants to provide them with support, particularly around rent arrears when there's situations that arise that are no fault of the tenant's own. So that's definitely something that I hope social landlords would work with victims of domestic abuse on in this case. With regards to the particular question around providing information and assistance, I think for our members that does go far enough. As Callum highlighted, a lot of our members are very small social landlords, and it wouldn't be practical for them to be able to rehouse, not just in terms of stock availability, but potential proximity to victim. However, I think within the guidance it is important that information and assistance isn't just a tick box exercise. It does have to be proper information and assistance in order that the perpetrator can be rehoused, because obviously we don't want the situation where anyone is being evicted into homelessness. So I think within these actions, we would certainly welcome, strong partnership working through that.
But what you're saying is you don't think it should be on the face of the bill?
I don't think there should be education or to rehouse. It should be the information and assistance.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Rona. I think Gary just wanted to come very briefly back in.
Sorry.
Gary, if you would be brief, please, that would be very helpful. And then after Gary, it will be John Finney. Gary?
Yeah, I just want to go into this thing about housing associations moving people when they're victims of domestic abuse. It literally doesn't happen. That's why there's so many women and victims of domestic abuse presenting as homeless. They go to the landlord or the social landlord and ask for a move because of domestic abuse. They're told to go down what's called the homeless route. You ask any worker that works in homelessness advice centres, that's what they're told to do. So this idea that the housing associations will move people doesn't happen. The idea that they can't is also nonsense. What they can do is they can have a working arrangement with other housing associations in the local area to move people to different areas within that locale. There's also nothing to stop us from moving people to different local authorities to another local authority when they're victims of domestic abuse without them having to go through the homelessness route. Because the homelessness route has been shown time and time again is really, really, really bad for anybody who goes through it. It's there for an emergency, and we really don't want to be putting victims and survivors of domestic abuse through the homelessness route when we can set legislation that allows them to move legally within local authorities and within housing associations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Gary. I appreciate those comments. John Finney, you've been waiting very patiently to ask questions to this panel. Over to you, please.
Thank you, convener. It's a very specific area, and it really is just is for Mr. John Chumsuk, the Chartered Institute of Housing, and it is about convener what some might refer to as future reforms, or indeed a view as a gap in the legislation. Mr. Chumsuk, the Scottish Government advises us that the working group, which your organisation co-chairs with Scottish Women Aid, on housing outcomes for women and children affected by domestic abuse, plans a second phase of work relating to the private sector housing, including our owner-occupier and the private rented housing. I wonder, can you maybe explain what that work will cover, the time frame for that work, please, and very particularly whether it will have regard to the unique situation, often overlooked, of the Gypsy Traveller community, please?
Thanks, Mr. Finney. Unfortunately, I can't really go into much. We haven't agreed the scope of the work at all. We've really just concluded the work on looking at social housing and trying to improve the housing outcomes for women and children experiencing domestic abuse in that sector. I think you raise a really useful point around some of the scope of the group. Me and my co-chair from Scottish Women, we just haven't had the time to reflect on what that work would explore. What I would say is the work this year probably lasted about 6 to 9 months. I would hope we'd start this early new year and have something out towards the latter half of 2021. But I think looking at the experience of kind of the Gypsy Traveller community within that, maybe an appropriate scope. But right now we just haven't pinned down the brief.
Okay, many thanks for that. That's perhaps something that we'll raise with the Cabinet Secretary. Many thanks. That's me, convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. That's all the questions that the committee has for this panel. It's been a very focused and a very useful panel. So can I just thank Paul Short, Callum Chomscook, Gary Burns and Stacey Dingwall for their help on the housing elements of this bill this morning. We're very grateful to you. This brings the public part of our meeting this morning to a close. Our next meeting will be on Tuesday, the 12th of January, when we will continue our consideration of the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill, hearing from the Cabinet Secretary. So could I just close by thanking all members of the committee and all the parliamentary staff who support us, both the clerks, but also perhaps especially this year, the broadcasting staff and the IT staff and everybody who works behind the scenes, as well as thanking all of the witnesses who have helped us with their time and consideration, not just in this inquiry, but in all of the inquiries that we've tried to undertake this year. And can I just wish everybody, as I think the Prime Minister said, a merry little Christmas this year. Thank you very much. See you next year.